Even naputol ba ako kanina? Mukhang na-unmute ako. Yes, sorry about that. Yung Christian faith natin is very much rewarded by those field trips that we have. So the difference with our pilgrimages that we sponsor sa different source we only limit it to 2 buses. No, as we go to the site, meron tayong apologetics or spiritual direction sa biyahe. No, we have our priest, si Brother Caloy, Gibatok, si Brother Marvin, and we also recite the Holy Rosary going to or coming from the places that we visited. So we have a full program. It is like a senior pala.
Good afternoon, everyone.
Good afternoon.
Let us put ourselves in the presence of God. In the name of the Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Spirit. Amen. Dear God, thank you for all the blessings you have bestowed upon us. We are truly grateful for them. Thank you for allowing us today to meet and share our knowledge and time with one another in this seminar. We extend your divine wisdom to our speaker, Mr. Carlos Antonio Palad, so that he would be able to impart effectively his God-given knowledge to all of us. May he be blessed as he continues to bring his expertise to people who need them. Bless the participants as well, so that they would be able to glean the vital information from this activity. May you bestow your blessings after this seminar, so that we may go out and spread what we learned in the spirit of love and generosity. May we realize that this activity should glorify your name through our Lord Jesus Christ, your Son, who lives and reigns with you in the unity of the Holy Spirit, one God, forever and ever. Amen. In the Father, Son, and the Holy Spirit. Amen. Mary, seat of wisdom, pray for us.
For us. Good afternoon, everyone. I'd like to introduce our speaker and our subject today. It's coming to the 500-year anniversary of Christianity in the Philippines. Our speaker is a member of Defensores Fidei Foundation. He is our historian, Philippine historian as well, including world history or Christianity. This is also the first time we offer this talk in the Philippines or Defensores Fidei. So medyo we have to learn 500 years of history in an hour, hour and a half, or this afternoon session with all of us. So Kaloy is opening up Q&A for those people who wants answers to the lingering questions that you might have about Philippine history, about Rizal or any movie that are shown or any authors. Feel free to type your question so that my co-host Eric will read it after the presentation. So because of its 500 years of history, we cannot cover, everything in hour and a half or 3 hours as well. So it's like reading so many books in one session that I'm afraid that our comprehension will not be enough. But I think it is very good for us to understand what we are going through and what we kind of expect about the development of Christianity in the Philippines. Is it gonna be better? It's gonna be. I'm pretty sure it will be challenged after Cardinal Sin, Archdiocese of Manila was divided into 5 dioceses. Carlos came to us as a philosophy enthusiast, and now he is taking up his MA degree in philosophy in the University of the Philippines in Diliman. He also got his undergraduate degree in University UP Diliman as well, also majoring in philosophy. Okay, he has been with us for a long time. Kasama ko din sa trabaho, our advocate in the issue of coconut oil, farmer, and the Philippine products as well, promoting it to international market. Aside from that, he's, I guess, an editor with Baronius Press, so quite involved with liturgy. Okay, without further ado, I'd like to give the floor to Mr. Carlos Palad.
Okay na? All right. So good afternoon sa lahat ng ating mga seminarians, sa lahat ng mga nakikinig ngayon dito sa Apologetics seminar natin sa Defensores Fidei. And this is already our 16th, 15th or 16th, I think 16th na Apologetics seminar, na annual Apologetics seminar. And as I have mentioned before, kasi some of you may have noticed that on several previous sessions, I've also been helping to co-moderate the webinar. I have mentioned that we always try to tweak the talks and the presentations that we give through the years. Hindi naman pwede na 2020 na, inuulit pa rin natin kung ano yung mga topics natin noong 2005 o noong 2010 or noong 2015. So today, I'm going to be giving a kind of introductory talk on 500 years of Catholicism and the Philippines. So it's actually a vast topic that covers several issues. History, national identity, and how we Filipinos see ourselves. And why is this to? Kasi we actually intend to hold a series of talks on Catholicism in the Philippines during the year 2021 as one of the ways by which we will be marking the 500th anniversary of the arrival of Catholicism in the Philippines. So my talk today is not intended to be a standalone talk. It is an introduction to various issues, to a handful of issues, a handful of topics that we will be dealing with in greater depth in the coming months, during 2021. So I'll just be giving a very short talk. I'll be dealing with a couple of questions, and then there will be a Q&A, which in this Q&A, I will be delving further into various topics on Philippine history. So Henry will be handling the Q&A, and the questions, I believe, are going to be very comprehensive. So this will also allow me to touch on various topics without this necessarily having to be strung together as a single lecture. And then I hope that you will continue to follow us, because next year we plan to have more talks delving more in depth into this topic. Things like ano ba yung proof for the retraction of Rizal, or yung relationship between the secular and the regular clergy, or the influence of the Friars, or yung Patronato Real. We will be discussing those things in the next several months in a series of talks. But for today, I'm just going to give a very brief introduction to the history of the church in the Philippines, and I will deal with some topics. So today we are celebrating the 500th anniversary of Catholicism in the Philippines. We have to be a bit careful, by the way, when we say that, because strictly speaking, after Magellan came to the Philippines in 1521 at iniwan yung Santo Niño, despite the baptism of Raha Humabon and around 800 of his subjects, there is no evidence that Catholicism as such continued. Diba? Kasi nga, umalis agad yung mga Kastila, and they were not able to initially able to put down deep roots for the Catholic faith. Ang talagang definitive na establishment ng Catholicism in the Philippines came in the year 1565. Nevertheless, we still celebrate 1521 for a variety of reasons. First and foremost, it is really in 1521 that with the coming of the Santo Niño, we can think of it perhaps not as a institutional establishment of Catholicism in the Philippines, but as a spiritual establishment. The Santo Niño came to Cebu. And even though the pagans in Cebu who were baptized did not really understand the gift that they had been given, the seed had been planted. The Santo Niño was already in their midst. And as we all know, sacred images, sacred icons have great power. They bring down great grace. And we can be certain that when the Santo Niño was left with the Cebuanos in 1521, that was a sign that God's grace will not let them die far away. Kumbaga, God's grace will not hindi may iwan ang Pilipinas from the light of the gospel, or from the grace of God. And indeed, after 2 generations, bumalik ang mga Kastila, and through Miguel Lopez de Legazpi, definitively established the Catholic Church in the Philippines. Now, usually when Philippine history is discussed, nagiging issue palagi yung question ng national identity. Sa Facebook at sa social media, napapansin ko, dumadami yung mga groups na dedicated to discussing Philippine history. And then that's a good thing. It means that Filipinos are hungry for more knowledge about the past, about the history and the heritage of their country. Ang problema dito is when the past is mythologized. Instead of Filipinos looking for real history, we look for ways to portray our history as much bigger or as much grander or very different than it really is. Kasi we want to establish an identity that is divorced from our Spanish or from our Western heritage. Kaya nga nakikita natin yung tendency na i-define yung term na Filipino, ano ba talaga ang Filipino, ano ba talaga ang kultura natin, bilang indigenous. No? So, ang tunay na Filipino culture is yung pre-Hispanic culture. So, sinasabi dito sa ideolohiya na ito, na yung Spanish culture o yung Spanish heritage natin, parang add-on lang yan sa tunay na kultura natin bilang mga Pilipino. And that we should actually hate and lament the coming of Spanish culture kasi this was a corruption. This was a distortion of what Filipino culture and Filipino history really is. And there are may comment about the audio. Okay, sorry. Alright. So when we are discussing Filipino culture, usually Filipino history, there is a tendency to seek refuge in all sorts of myths about the past. I'm sure naririnig natin yung mga kwento-kwento na nakikita natin, madalas sa mga pro-Marcos websites, sa mga pro-Marcos at pro-Duterte Facebook pages, may mga kwento daw about Lemuria, or tayo daw ay isang kaharian, isang napakayamang kaharian bago dumating ang mga Kastila. Or meron yung mga nagseek refuge sa mga kwento tungkol sa supposedly parte daw ang Pilipinas ng Srivijaya at ng Majapahit empires. The Srivijaya and the Majapahit empires were Indonesian empires. Although the term Indonesia itself is an anachronism when applied to them, kasi when you say history, or when you say Indonesia, you're also talking, just like the Philippines, about a country, about an identity or a geographical identity na hindi naman talaga indigenous binuo lang rin ito ng mga colonizers. Kung tayo, Pilipinas, ang Indonesia, binuo ng mga Dutch. So, there is this tendency na we try to latch on Philippine history to the long-gone empires of other countries, of other lands, kasi we are trying to look for an identity that is older and more ancient and perhaps in our dreams, ay mas glorious than our actual past. The issue here is, ang tanong ngayon is, kano ba talaga kalakas yung evidence para sabihin na bago dumating ang mga Kastila, we were a great and glorious civilization? Now, many scholars, for example, or rather many nationalists, would point to things such as, nandiyan sa slide ngayon, yung slide please. Just a slide ngayon, yung Golden Tara. No, the Golden Tara, although it's actual, who it actually portrays is still a matter of controversy. It is most likely of Hindu-Buddhist, it is most likely of Buddhist origin. At makita rin natin for example, sa gold collection dun sa Ayala Museum, which I advise all of you to visit one day once the pandemic is over. May makikita tayo ng mga gold jewelry na natagpuan sa mga pre-Hispanic tombs or pre-Hispanic graves, usually sa Mindanao. Meron dong mga Buddhist at Hindu figures, may mga Buddhist and Hindu mga motifs, and of course you also have the Laguna copper plate inscription, the oldest inscription found in the Philippines, that definitively dated. So it's dated to around the year 900 AD. But all of these, when you put them together, they still form a very incomplete picture. Kasi napapansin natin, we have all of these small artifacts, small gold statues, small jewelry. Granted, we have the large balanghay boat sa Butuan at sa mga iba't ibang grave sites all over the Philippines, such as in Batangas, may makikita tayong mga porcelain, pinakakilala dito yung sa Calatagan at yung sa archaeological site sa Santa Ana Church na ngayon ay sarado na. What I mean is yung archaeological site mismo, which is actually none other than the courtyard of the church itself. Pero ang makikita natin dito, we just have these various artifacts that prove that pre-Hispanic natives of what we now call the Philippines were in commercial contact with China, with ancient Malay and ancient Indo-Chinese and ancient Indonesian cultures. Pero hindi ito nangangahulugan na merong isang definitive or definite na sibilisasyon na makikita sa what sasabi na natin ngayon, Pilipinas. All it proves is between various groups in the Philippines, in what is now the Philippines, and various groups sa Malaysia, sa Indonesia, sa Indochina, merong mga trade, may mga trade links, may nakukuha tayo mga influences mula sa kanila, but it does not prove that we were able to create a great and grandiose civilization na kasing grande ng sabihin natin yung mga Khmers ng Cambodia na ginawa yung Angkor Wat. O kaya yung mga empire sa Indonesia na binuo ang Borobudur. As has been pointed out, sa kahit anong gawin ng mga archaeologists natin, ni isang monumento mula sa pre-Hispanic era, wala pa nadidiscover sa Pilipinas. Of course, when we say monuments, we're talking about yung mga temples, stone or brick temples. Wala tayong ganun. So these all point, even the Spanish chroniclers can point to the fact na although there were signs of culture, signs of civilization in the Philippines, we were not necessarily a civilization. There was not necessarily a united and great civilization sa Pilipinas bago dumating ang mga Kastila. Now, why is this so important? Anong kinalaman nito sa apologetics? Anong kinalaman nito sa history natin? Because ultimately, the importance of the Spanish era and of Catholicism is that we can argue that the Spanish influence, especially through Catholicism, is what actually formed us into a coherent and into a very definite and unique culture or unique nation. Kaya tayo Pilipinas, hindi parte ng Indonesia, hindi parte ng Malaysia. Kaya tayo Pilipinas as it is most of all because it was the Spaniards who formed us who helped formulate yung essential basics ng ating national identity. And Catholicism is an essential part of that identity also. So when we try to deny that the Spanish heritage, or when we try to deny that Catholicism are important to our national identity, we are actually hitting the very things that make us Filipino in the first place. So, yung mga nagsasabi na na tayo mga lowlanders, tayo mga Kristiyano, mga Christian Filipinos, lalo-lalo na yung mga nag-embrace ng Catholicism, we are not truly Filipino, we are not truly, kumbaga, hindi talaga natin minamahal ang ating sariling bansa, ating sariling kultura dahil patuloy nating pinaniniwalaan ng isang banyaga or foreign religion na dapat at nating iwaksi. The only thing I can say is, para sa kanila, sino ngayon ang tunay na Pilipino? Diba? Ang mga Igorot ba? Ang mga Moro? Sila lang ang authentically o tunay na Pilipino? Now, I would like to clarify this. I'm not saying na since I deny na sila lang ang authentically Filipino, therefore, ang mga Igorot at mga Moro ay hindi talaga Pilipino. Hindi ko pa sasabi yun. They are important parts of the Filipino nation as it currently exists. But what I would deny and what we Filipino Catholics should deny, lalong-lalo na pagkausap natin yung mga indigenista o yung mga purists pagdating sa mga diskusyon online about Philippine history, the reason we need to be very careful about this is we Christian Filipinos, we Catholic Filipinos, we Filipinos who fully embrace our Spanish heritage are just as Filipino as the Igorots, just as Filipino as the Moros. True Filipino identity, in fact, could not have been without the intervention of the West in the first place. Our own national hero, Jose Rizal, he wrote in Spanish, he thought in Spanish, he was thoroughly educated in the Western tradition. If we are going to be consistent, then dapat hindi siya tunay na hero natin or dapat hindi natin siya ituring na tunay na Pilipino. Kasi nga, he is a product of the Western heritage. And I might even dare say of the Catholic tradition because he was educated in Ateneo and the UST. It is especially in these schools, especially in UST, where he gained yung kanyang intellectual armory with which he later on fought colonialism itself. So kailangan nating palaging alalahanin na without the Spanish tradition and without the Christian tradition, we would not have the Filipino identity of today. Catholicism and the Spanish tradition are essential to the Filipino identity. They are not accidental and they are definitely not corruptions. They are definitely not distortions of Filipino identity. Yung slide, please. So, sabi nga ni Nick Joaquin sa kanyang groundbreaking essay na Culture as History, which I'm going to be frank with you, should be required reading for any Filipino Catholic apologist. So it's Nick Joaquin, Culture as History. This should be required reading. I believe that it's still in print. Sabi niya, history has our dates down in black and white and knows that the Filipino, because he was created in the 16th and 17th centuries, by a tool-forged fusion of tribes from Luzon, Visayas, and Mindanao, Spanish and Chinese mestizos, etc., and molded into form by a geography only from then on existing as a political unit, cannot be traced farther back than that fusion and that form, as no individual existence can be traced farther back than the moment of conception, which determined that what was to be born would be this person and no other. Before 1521, we could have been anything and everything not Filipino. After 1565, we can be nothing but Filipino. We may veer in course or speak new tongues or suffer upheavals of character, but all these changes will only serve to intensify the identity whose basic outlines were cast in the 16th and the 17th centuries. Break lang May mga messages na mahina yung audio. Nakikita ko kasi yung mga comments dito. Kanyo ano muna? Tanggalin niyo muna yung ano ko. Ayusin ko lang to. Just a minute, please. Nakikita ko kasi yung mga comments at pop up. Puro mga reklamo tungkol dun sa audio.
Nag-join nga ako sa DFF ka wala kasi. Sige bro, hindi pa monitor natin.
Si Eric ba ang admin?
Ito kasi sa Facebook at saka sa YouTube monitoring ko okay siya.
Okay.
Sa Zoom lang yun. Kailangan nila nakasanit sa Zoom nila.
Okay. Sige.
Ready?
All right.
Okay na, perfect.
Okay. All right. So resuming our talk, I hope the audio is better now. So I hope the audio is better now. So balik lang tayo dito sa how did we become Filipino. Importante po kasi naiintindihan natin itong mga bagay na ganito, no? Even if they're a bit abstract. Kasi importante po sila.
Cedar Media, kindly unmute.
Nakamute daw. Nakamute pa ako.
Kindly unmute po, Cedar Media.
Cedar Media, unmute.
Paki-unmute bro. Ito kanina.
I-off na muna ako. I-off muna ako.
Ito na. Okay na.
Dito naka-unmute pa rin.
Sino ba nag-host yung Zoom?
Oo.
Sino ang host?
Si Sir. May nag-unmute eh.
Pwede nang gawin ni Eric eh. The host like you to unmute.
Dito si Sir, ano yun?
Hindi. Host. Hindi mo naman naka-unmute. The host would like to unmute. Baka napipindot niya lang to.
Ayan.
Okay, teka.
Ready?
Teka, sadali.
Okay, ready?
All right. All right. So I hope the audio is better now. I hope naririnig na tayo. I guess I'll spice culture from the Indies, nor architecture from Java, nor mathematics and the sciences from the Arabs. In short, in terms of civilization, we seem to have gotten none of the basic media from our Asian neighbors. What might have been the true history of the Philippines but for 1521? The known facts about us and about Asia then volunteer the answer. If the West had not come, and if the local push of Islam had continued to slow down, and if Asia had remained as indifferent as ever, then we would be today, much like the Papuans and Samoans, a small Pacific pocket of paganism, with various Muslim city-states on the coasts, various river kingdoms in the interior, various clan turfs in the hills, and all these groupings generally unaware of each other. So this is also why 1521 is so important. 1521 is the year when we came into the radar of the West, so to speak. And from then on, Westernization became inevitable. Now, it might be said, yung West lang ba talaga ang magbibigay ng sibilisasyon sa atin? Ito yung sagot ni Joaquin. The fact is, the Philippines had been in touch with China, for example, for at least 500 years. The earliest attested year of our contact with China was actually the year 982 AD, when there were traders, when there was merchandise from Mindoro that arrived in Canton. Around those years, we know period. All of these trade seems that our level of civilization was always much lower than theirs. We never evolved the kind of urban or high density or high value trading high value trading na meron yung mga ibang sibilisasyon na nakapaligid sa Pilipinas. So as Nick Joaquin pointed out, it was eventually the West, through Spain of course, that played the role of civilizing the Philippines. And because of the fact that it was Spain that a great civilization, or sana we could have become just like for worse, it was the coming of the Spaniards that proved to be our path to nationhood. And ano yung pinaka-instrument? Tribes. Us to see ourselves as part of one greater community. Naturally, under the rule of Spain, pero yung Catholicism yung pinaka-glue. Because without the Filipino people from Luzon and Visayas and parts of Mindanao being converted to Catholicism, it would never have been, the Philippines would never have been the country that we now have. I mean, there is nothing in our geography that by itself would make us a one country. No? It is perfectly possible that had the Philippines remained unconquered by Spain, Mindanao could be part of some Malay state. It could be part of a state based in Borneo, or Luzon could be an independent country, or it could be part of another state based in Taiwan. There's nothing in our geography that by itself would make us one country. Only an idea could have turned us into one country, and that one idea ultimately was Catholicism and its influence. Gregorio Zaide, whom many people now despise, unfortunately, Gregorio Zaide once said that Christianity, Spain's greatest contribution to the Filipino people, is the living faith which has wrought a remarkable transformation in their lives. By the sign of the cross, the people were brought to a higher plane of life and were united as children of one God. Gregorio Zaide is one of our pioneer historians, although he may have been mistaken in certain elements in his in his historical works, we still owe it to him that he was one of the great codifiers of Philippine history. Kumbaga, isa siya sa mga pinaka nagbuo nung modern narrative of Philippine history as we now see it. Karamihan sa atin, yung history na natutunan natin sa ating mga paaralan is basically the history that was codified by Zaiden. Now, whatever Zaiden's imperfections and mistakes were, we still owe that vision of history to him. And para sa kanya, the greatest contribution of Spain was Christianity. Now, this is very important kasi, again, I think this is very important kasi the moment we begin questioning the importance of our Christian identity to the Filipino identity that we have, we are exposing Christianity in the Philippines to even stronger attack. Because there's already a tendency in much of Philippine historiography to see the church as an agent of pure evil. Alam naman natin from our experiences in our schools, in our universities, that the Spanish era and the Friars are usually portrayed as evil. Parang wala silang mabuting nagawa sa ating kasaysayan. As to the good things that they were able to do, I would like to discuss that in the coming months. No? Kaya nga Defensores Fidei will be holding several talks on church history. But let it be pointed out for now that yung formation of our Filipino identity was not a one-way street as well. No? It was not simply the Spaniards bringing Catholicism and then imposing it on the Filipinos just like that. The reason I chose this picture to show to you, dito sa slide na to, yung Catholic and Filipino, if you look at it carefully, this is the pulpit of San Agustin Church. You may be asking, anong kinalaman ng pulpito ng San Agustin Church dyan? Well, if you look closely, unfortunately wala akong makitang mas high resolution na picture eh. But if any of you may be so minded to revisit San Agustin Church once this pandemic is over, papapansin ninyo na yung dekorasyon sa ilalim nitong pulpitong ito ay isang nakabaliktad na pinya. You may be wondering, so ano yung nakabaliktad na pinya na yan? It is actually a sign of the individualization of this piece of art. Kasi ang gumawa po ng pulpito na ito, hindi po Kastila. Ang gumawa po nito ay Filipino artisans or Filipino craftsmen. And as is true with so much else of what we can find in old churches, such as in Laguna and Rizal, yung mga artworks po makikita natin sa mga old churches na yan. Hindi naman po Kastila ang gumawa niya, mga Pilipino po who had imbibed the spirit of Catholicism and then created sacred art. Sacred art that was neither Mexican, neither Spanish, but Filipino. So makikita natin from the 17th century onwards, from the 16th and the 17th century onwards, we really made Catholicism part and parcel of our own culture. Hindi po siya foreign imposition na gusto lang natin tanggalin, o gusto tanggalin ng ating mga ninuno. It became truly part and parcel of our spirit, you can say. Later on, dun sa Q&A, pag-uusapan po natin yung mga iba't ibang elements by which this Catholicism can continue to be seen in our culture. So, kanina nabanggit ko yung the way that the heritage of Catholicism in the Philippines is demonized. And one of the questions here is, was the Philippine Revolution completely anti-Catholic? Because there's a tendency for us to see the Philippine Revolution as the you can say the catalyst for Filipino identity as we now have it. So alam naman po nating lahat yung ating mga natututunan sa history na sila Rizal at sila Marcelo del Pilar, binuo nila yung propaganda movement sa Espanya. Kasi mga Ilustrados were mainly rationalists and Masons, and the Katipunan was mainly Freemasonic, and they were thoroughly against the church, thoroughly against the Friars. But we need to ask, was the Philippine Revolution really completely anti-Catholic? We need to keep in mind, first and foremost, that the Philippines in 1896 is not the same as the Philippines of today. Transportation, communications, media have essentially turned our concept of our country into something much smaller than it was for Filipinos 120 years ago. What do I mean? Ngayon po, pag mula sa Metro Manila, gusto mong pumuntang Cavite, Cavite can be just an hour away or even half an hour away if you're in the southern part of Metro Manila. So, para sa ating Cavite, katabi lang yan. Malapit lang yan. But 120 years ago, going to parts of Rizal, or what is now Rizal, which at the time was the province of Tondo, or if you're going to Cavite, or if you're going to what is now Batangas, if you're going to these places, they were a lot farther away, which meant that the way that the Katipunan spread from one province to the next was actually very different. Kumbaga, magkakaiba yan. So, iba po yung Katipunan sa Manila kaysa dun sa Katipunan sa Cavite. And in Katipunan, where you have in the Katipunan in Manila, where Andres Bonifacio, of course, was there, and so mas malakas yung kanyang influence, the Freemasonic influence was, or rather, the rationalist and anti-clerical influence was much stronger. Because for Andres Bonifacio, who was known to be very anti-clerical, very anti-friar, part of the layunin, part ng kagustuhan ng Katipunan was, of course, to overthrow not just Spanish rule, but also Spanish ideas. It will be interesting to know what would have happened to the Philippines had Bonifacio really succeeded and become the ruler of at least the Tagalog region. But while the Katipunan in Manila was highly Masonic, the Katipunan in Cavite was Masonic then. There's also the Masonic influence. Aguinaldo was a Freemason. But the anti-religiousness was not as bad. And one of the most striking examples of this, I can show you, one of the most striking examples of this can be seen in this slide. To the left are examples of the seals of the Katipunan that were discovered in Manila in the course of, in around 1896. And makikita niyo dito na merong mga symbols that are obviously Masonic in origin. On the other hand, nakikita niyo naman siguro sa kanan, sino itong mga nakaluhod na to? And that is actually Aguinaldo and the other officers of the Magdalo faction of the Katipunan, swearing before the cross, the Santa Cruz de Tanza, their oaths of office when they became the heads of the revolutionary movement in Cavite in 1897. So from the very start, there was actually a fine line, a fine split between the attitudes of the Katipunan in Manila and the Katipunan and therefore of the revolution in Cavite. Ang pinakamagandang example nito is the way that the Katipunan treated the Augustinian Friars in Cavite, especially the much maligned Fray Antonio Perniavieja, who is rumored to be one of the historical basis, it is said, of Fray Damaso. Although Damaso was a Franciscan supposedly, while Perniavieja was an Augustinian. When Perniavieja was turned over to Andres Bonifacio's group, he was tortured, he was killed. Many other friars, I think 21 Augustinian friars, or, well, I'm not sure if all of them were Augustinian, but 21 friars were killed by the forces of Andres Bonifacio. And we know that when that news reached Aguinaldo, Aguinaldo was very angry and he publicly condemned the killing of the friars. And it is said that one of the reasons why Emilio Aguinaldo later on had Andres Bonifacio killed in April or May 1897. Historically, it has been said that Bonifacio was killed in May 10, 1897, but there are still doubts whether that actually was the date he was killed. There are even doubts whether the trial really took place. No? So that's why I say April, May 1897. But Aguinaldo said that one of the reasons that he had Bonifacio killed was to punish him for the killing of friars under his jurisdiction. But what is more important is, according to historical research on the Cavite aspect, or rather on the Cavite side of the revolution, alam natin na they were in fact very, very religious, or there was a tendency among them to support religion. So for example, alam natin na Artemio Ricarte, according to his testimony, Artemio Ricarte, of course, is one of the leaders of the Philippine Revolution, and he would become famous for not swearing loyalty to America, which is why he was exiled. He spent most of his life in exile in Japan until the 1940s when he returned back to the Philippines. Well, Artemio Ricarte reported that in Cavite, in the parts that were held by the revolutionaries, there was actually much greater love of God. That's what he said. He claimed that there was actually much greater love of God than in normal times. And we know that in parts of Cavite, the Katipuneros were ordered to go to Mass on Sundays and holy days of obligation. We even know that there were Katipuneros who attended Mass almost every day or even daily. So yung attitude towards Catholicism was always different among the various factions of the Katipunan. And we know na both Baldomero Aguinaldo and Emilio Aguinaldo would issue circulars asking for prayers for victory. And for example, in 1896, when the revolutionaries in Cavite had won over the Spaniards in Novaleta, we know that the Katipuneros decreed 3 days of thanksgiving and of prayers to the Blessed Virgin Mary. And meron pang record of at least once, there's even a record of Katipuneros asking for the exposition of the Blessed Sacrament. These are all in Cavite. And of course, we know about Aguinaldo's attitude. Now, just before he declared the revolution in Kawit, he informed the Spanish cura parroco of Kawit about what was going to happen para makatakas siya. In contrast, the Katipuneros from Manila were not above killing priests or killing friars. Kaya dito pa lang, may kita natin na we cannot unequivocally say na just because someone was associated with the revolution or someone was associated with Katipunan, therefore anti-religious na siya or anti-Catholic na siya. It may be better to say na the Katipunan overall was anti-Spanish and to a certain extent anti-friar. But to what extent their being anti-Spanish and anti-friar became anti-Catholic was different from one group of Katipuneros or one group of revolutionaries to the next. And in fact, although Emilio Aguinaldo would disband the Katipunan, he would later on revive it around the year 1900. And when he revived the Katipunan in the year 1900, in order to in order to resist the Americans, you might be interested to know about what he commanded as the way to enroll Katipuneros. If in the early Katipunero, if in the early Katipunan there was the use of the blood compact, alam naman natin lahat from history, diba? Blood compact, you slash your you slash yourself and you use your blood to sign your membership in the Katipunan. In the revived Katipunan that was to resist the Americans, the way of being inducted into it was specifically the way he swore his oath of office in Tanza, which is kneeling down, right hand up in front of the cross. So there was a much more overt appeal to the religious sense of Filipinos after the year 1900, and that alone should tell you something. Even the Katipuneros, even the Revolutionarios realized that you could not extirpate attachment to Catholicism from the Filipinos. It was not that easy. It's not going to be easy. And as we would later on find out, even when the Iglesia Filipina Independiente was founded in 1902, one of their tactics in order to keep as much as about a third of the Filipino people as part of the Aglipayan Church was to keep the rituals unchanged, although that didn't really last long. But the point was, the rank and file Filipinos were patriotic, but they were also attached in one way or another to Catholicism. And even the Katipuneros had to recognize that. In addition, there were also priests who were deeply involved in the Philippine Revolution. But first, let us trace this back a little bit. Most of us are familiar with the Gomburza. Padre Gomez, Padre Burgos, Padre Zamora, the three secular priests who spearheaded the clamor for ecclesiastical reform in the Philippine Church in the 1860s until they were unjustly executed in 1872. Now, why is this important? Because this shows to you that the origins of the ideals that actually inspired much of the Philippine Revolution were also tied up with Catholicism. Nung pong 1859, dumating ang mga Jesuita sa Pilipinas. At dahil dumating yung mga Jesuita, this led to, you can say, a reshuffling of the parishes in the Philippines. And as part of this, more and more churches that had been pastored by Filipino clergy, yung mga Indio priests, o yung mga Creole priests, o yung mga Mestizo priests, who were diocesan priests, more and more of their churches were given over to the friars, or to the religious. And this was contrary to the letter of canon law, which said at the time, parishes Filipino, or by which we mean, to be more precise, most of the secular priests at the time, virtually all of the secular priests at the time, were either Indio or Mestizo, either Chinese Mestizo or Spanish Mestizo. So, headed by Pedro Pelaez, who was a canon of the Cathedral of Manila, they began organizing and clamoring for change. And one of the ways by which they tried to effect change was that in the 1860s, you had more and more secular priests on their own trying to gain the higher ecclesiastical degrees in UST, the University of Santo Tomas, which was also known at the time as the University of Manila. So their goal was to show that Filipino priests, I'll answer questions later. No? So yung mga Filipino priests were trying to show that in terms of learning, they were just as competent, if not more competent, than the friars themselves. There's a very interesting corollary here, by the way. Apparently, at one point in the late 1860s, there were more secular priests who had doctorates, who had higher degrees, and this scared the peninsular Spanish government, which is why the Spanish government decided that there will be no more, informally decided that there will be no more conferral of doctorates, of theological doctorates on Filipino clergy, which is precisely what happened after 1871. Although there is no sign of a formal decree as such saying that Filipino priests could not earn the doctorate, in practice it was no longer given to them after 1871. So Jose Burgos himself was one of these doctorate holders. Can we have a break? Sandali lang excuse me lang. Can we... That's right. 1 minute, 1 minute. All right. Sorry for the naka-unmute pa daw. Okay na? Okay. So, pasensya na for the disturbance. I had to change chairs. Kasi, hindi yata ako kaya nung inuupuan ko kanina. So, just to continue, I'll be continuing for another 20 minutes, and then we will have a long Q&A. We actually have a long prepared list of questions that will cover various aspects of Filipino church history, and then we will go to the open Q&A for your questions. So, all right. So, dito sa slide ito, pinakikita ko dito yung dalawang revolutionaries. Dalawang pare who were deeply involved with the Philippine Revolution. One, of course, is Pedro Dandan. And we know that Pedro Dandan was one of the most, shall we say, probably one of the more controversial priests who were involved in the Philippine Revolution. And he was one of the associates of the Gomburza, although luckily he was not executed. He was simply exiled to the Marianas in 1872 after the Cavite Mutiny. Now, interestingly enough, when he was able to come back to the Philippines, he actually rose and became a cleric of the archdiocese. So he became a cleric in the cathedral, in Manila Cathedral itself, where he was he was second cantor, or he was part of the, you can say, the capellania, the group that sang the divine office in the cathedral. However, in 1896, he joined the Revolutionaries. He joined the forces of Licerio Geronimo in Montalban, and he even became one of the leaders of the revolutionary forces in Central Luzon until he died in 1897. The other person in the slide, the one to the right, is of course Bishop Jorge Barlin, who is better known as the first Filipino priest the first Filipino bishop. He was consecrated in 1906. And we know that in 1898, when the Spanish forces left Bicol, the civil power was left with him. And when civil power was left to him, we know that he governed his province for a number of years, or for a couple of years, under the authority of the Malolos Republic. So what is important here is to show that when it came to the Philippine Revolution, there were priests who were fiery, who were really involved in fighting the Spaniards, and later on actually fighting the Americans, such as Father Pedro Dandan in fighting the Spaniards. But you also have priests who preferred to be peacemakers, who did not necessarily fight against the foreign forces, but who at the same time loved their country in their own way. Perhaps a better example is Pedro Singzon, who would later on become the third Filipino bishop. Father Pedro Singzon, who would later on become the Bishop of Calbayog, was known during his time as de facto vicar in Cebu of Bishop Alcocer, when the Spanish bishop had left Cebu, and Father Singzon was left there to manage ecclesiastical matters. We know that Father Singzon, on one hand, recognized the Malolos Republic. On the other hand, he was a lion in defense of the privileges of the church. And he was also a stickler for liturgical, for liturgical rules. And one way by which he demonstrated it was when in December 30, 1898, he did not allow the solemn mass to be, or rather, he did not allow a requiem mass to be celebrated for the soul of Jose Rizal. And the reason that he didn't do this, he didn't allow it, was because it was contrary to the rubrics. Although in other places, such as in Albay and in Manila and in Malolos, there was actually solemn masses of requiem celebrated for the feast of, for the soul, for the repose of the soul of Jose Rizal. So when we keep in mind that there were various priests, Filipino priests, who were on the side of the revolution, this opens a very interesting theological question. Were they right? Did their involvement in the Philippine Revolution mean that the Philippine Revolution was actually something that is, you can say, approved by the teachings of the doctrine of the Catholic Church? And I would answer that in a much more nuanced way. We need to keep in mind that when it comes to political things such as revolutions, the Church very rarely issues dogmatic or doctrinal rulings. Very rare. You can say that in the time of the Philippine Revolution and then later on the resistance to the Americans, there were three sides in the Church. On one hand, you had the Spanish Friars, who obviously supported Spanish sovereignty. And a little later, when the Americans took over, they also supported American sovereignty because, as far as they were concerned, legitimate sovereignty over the Philippines had been transferred from Spain to America. And many of these Spanish friars were opposed to the Philippine Revolution, not simply because they were Spaniards, but because of principled grounds. This is something that we frequently forget. When the Spanish friars opposed the revolution, it was not necessarily because they were evil Spanish imperialists who just wanted to keep Filipinos enslaved. That is how it's portrayed in our schools, madalas. The friars were just Spanish patriots and they subordinated church to state, to state or to patriotic interests. In their case, Spanish patriotic interests. But we need to keep in mind also what the friars were trying to avoid. The friars, first and foremost, had the experience of the 19th century to guide them. In the 19th century, the Spanish religious orders, especially the mendicant orders and the Jesuits, had repeatedly been persecuted in Spain by revolutionary, liberal, and Freemasonic governments. In particular, there was the terrible suppressions of 1835, wherein numerous monasteries were turned into state property by the Spanish state under the influence of liberals and Freemasons. And the Jesuits themselves were expelled from time to time, and the religious orders were also threatened with expulsion from time to time. So if you were a Spanish friar, and here you are in the Philippines, face to face with religious orders, or rather with revolutionaries who seem to be inspired by the same ideologies, the same rationalistic and Masonic frame of thought that had inspired the same people who persecuted them in Spain. Guess how they will react? Siyempre, di sila matutuwa, di sila maging supportive. I think we need to have that empathetic, mindset na the friars were also human beings. They were also afraid for their lives. They were also afraid for their faiths. And in fact, the revolutionaries here, in repeating the need for the friars to be kicked out entirely of the Philippines, a demand that was repeated again and again by Aguinaldo, even though he himself was not opposed to Catholicism, he was opposed to the Friars. No? So Aguinaldo kept repeating the need to expel the Friars, and we know that had the Malolos Republic survived, they were planning on making the degrees from UST unrecognized. No? So they were going to really do everything to kick the Friars out. Of course, if you're a Spanish Friar, we're not going to be happy about that. Diba? So being angry at the Spanish Friars for not supporting the Philippine Revolution and for not supporting the War of Independence ng mga Pilipino against Spain, that's shall we say, that's a bit narrow-minded too. We also need to remember that 120 years after history has ended, or rather after the revolution has ended, we also need to keep in mind that we need to have a much more objective view of the situation at that time. And in the end, the important thing for us, of course, is to die well. For us Catholics, it's to die well. And it's important to note that many revolutionaries and many ilustrados actually died as Catholics. You have Jose Rizal, who retracted his adherence to Freemasonry and his denial of Catholic doctrines. You have Marcelo del Pilar, who was the author of some of the worst attacks on the Catholic faith in La Solidaridad and in other venues. You have Isabelo de los Reyes, who is the true founder of the Iglesia Filipina Independiente. You have the Luna brothers. You have Deodato Arellano, who was the first president of Katipunan. All of them retracted their adherence to Freemasonry, while Emilio Aguinaldo, who we know was a Mason, we know that he was given a Catholic funeral when he died in 1964. So whatever their positions may have been against the church or against the friars or against the Spanish clergy during the Philippine Revolution, or before that, or during the propaganda, during the time of the propaganda before the Philippine Revolution, the important thing is they did not see their loyalty to their principles as somehow dangerous or somehow incompatible with being Catholic. Okay. And in dying as Catholics or in receiving the sacraments of the church at their death, or rather in dying in the bosom of the Catholic Church, they were able to demonstrate that one can be a sincere Catholic and also be, at the very least, loyal to the best principles of the Philippine Revolution. So I think I'm rambling a bit too long. We still have many questions to deal with. So Henry, is Sir Henry there?
Yes, Kaloy. Nawala. Naputo lang signal ko.
No. Let's begin with the questions. Eric, you can read the questions now.
Okay. These questions were emailed to us so separately. So first question would be, why should we commemorate Magellan?
Okay, I think we should. I'll start with an anecdote. No, earlier this year, I was in Spain on a short research tour in Madrid, and we went to the Museo de Naval, or rather the Museo Naval, and they had there an exhibit on Magellan. It was in preparation for next year, and part of it was a sort of animated yung isang engraving nung pagpatay kay Magellan by the natives of Mactan was parang inanimate nila. So para siyang GIF na sinasaksak si Magellan all the time. And one of my colleagues asked one of the Spaniards present, sabi niya, I hope you don't mind, but I cheered for the person killing Magellan. And the Spaniard answered, it's perfectly okay. He's not Spaniard, he's Portuguese. So yung isa sa mga masasabi natin about Magellan was, he did not seek to conquer the Philippines the way we think of. He came here as a conquistador to put the entire Philippines under the chains of oppression, ganyan. And for that matter, neither was Lapu-Lapu a freedom fighter for the Philippines. Some years ago, there was a kind of tableau that was shown, reenactment ng Battle of Mactan, and it actually had Lapu-Lapu crying out, "Mabuhay ang Pilipinas." And in 1521, there was no Pilipinas yet. So, yung importansya ng pagdating ni Magellan is he was an intrepid and brave explorer. And by yung kanyang heroism in trying to circumnavigate the world was the indispensable way by which the Philippines became, you can say, part of the it became part of the Western sphere of influence. If I may add, because of because of Magellan, you have later on the coming of Legazpi, because Magellan's arrival put us on the radar, so to speak. Of course, wala pang radar but it put us on the map. It put us within the vision of the European powers. And when the Philippines became a permanent colony of the Philippines under Legazpi, some Spanish historians have argued that it was with Manila that the true age of globalization, the true age of internationalization actually began. Why? Because the Philippines was already trading with Asia. Europe was also trading with Asia, but they were trading through the old world. They were trading through the Eurasian landmass, yung mga trade routes na dumadaan doon. Through the Philippines, nagkaroon ngayon ng first trading route that linked Asia to the Americas, and the Americas in turn were linked by the Spaniards to Europe. So with the colonization of the Philippines, you can say that the great chain, the great link of communications that connected the entire world in an unbroken line, in an unbroken wave, in an unbroken link. So Philippines, America, Europe, Asia, Philippines, interconnected siya. Because of this, the Philippines actually became, you can say, one of the cradles of globalization. And we would not have had that privilege, at least not the way history happened, without the feat of Magellan. So thanks to Magellan, the Philippines, for better or for worse, became, you can say, part of the Western world. And so he deserves to be commemorated. Like I said kanina, 1521 really is the pivotal date in Philippine history. It is the date after which we truly went on the path of becoming the Filipino people that we are now. Okay.
So next question would be, what are the strengths and weaknesses of Hispanic Catholicism imported into the Philippines?
Yung Catholicism na inimport sa atin ng mga Kastila had a number of strengths. The very first strength it had was a very intense devotion, a very intense devotionalism. And makita natin yan hanggang ngayon, yung devotion natin sa Passion of Christ, yung devotion natin kay Mama Mary, and yung devotion natin kay Santo Niño. Now, these were devotions to the humanity of Christ and to the Blessed Virgin Mary. During the Spanish era, our devotion to the humanity of Christ took on a very particular form. It was a devotion to the passion and to the symbols of the passion. Kaya nga po sa Pilipinas, napakadami nung ating mga banal na mga cross, no? Yung mga krus ng Alitagtag, krus ng Tanza, sa Binondo, yung Santa Tes, yung mga crucifixes, yung mga venerated crucifixes that we find all over the Philippines. Second, of course, is yung devotion natin sa Nazareno na nakuha rin natin sa mga Kastila, no? Yung devotion natin to the suffering Christ. At yung ating devotion to the baby Jesus. So all of these have created in us Filipinos a deep and tender human affection, we can say, for the person of Christ. Meron tayong matinding concept ng pakikisimpatya with the humanity of Christ. And this is one of the greatest strengths of Filipino Catholicism kasi it really appeals to the heart. Now, this ensures that Catholicism is a religion of the heart. It is something that really resonates with us. And I think this is one of the reasons why, despite the attacks of Protestantism on the Catholic faith, they have not really succeeded in wrenching very many Filipinos away from the faith. May kita talaga natin na nandun yung around 80% of Filipinos are consistently Catholic from one census to the next. And I think that is because of the devotion, the spirit of devotion dinala ng mga Kastila sa ating bansa. So, meron tayong masasabi na isa pa natin masasabing strength, of course, nabanggit ko na kanina, is yung devotion natin to the Blessed Virgin Mary. We know from early colonial chronicles that Filipinos very frequently recited the entire 15 decades of the Holy Rosary during the 17th and 18th centuries. So it was common among Filipinos. And to this very day, of course, we are still one of the countries where the devotion of the Holy Rosary is most alive. And the third strength I think that it gave to the Philippines, or rather the strength of the Catholicism that we received from the Spaniards here in the Philippines, is yung very strong emphasis nito on the family. Yung the family being one. The Spaniards, of course, all Catholics naman, all Catholic cultures value the family. But in the Spanish tradition, there's a very, very strong emphasis talaga on the family. So that is why, for example, until recently in the Philippines, it is a tradition to pray the oración, the Angelus, every 6 p.m. as a family. As late as the 1940s, I've been told in some families, kung hindi ka nakauwi by 6 p.m. for orasyon, you got, napapalo ka. So, there's this very strong emphasis on the prayer of the family together. And I think this has survived to the present day. It's not a secret that until recently, Family Rosary Crusade, for example, was very strong in the Philippines, probably stronger here than elsewhere. And that's one of the strengths of So you can say the strengths of Spanish Catholicism as brought to the Philippines are rooted in piety. They're rooted in piety, they're rooted in personal devotion. I think there are two weaknesses that I could see. The first is the tendency for Spanish Catholicism to emphasize greatly the heart, but not so much the intellectual aspect. In Spain itself, Catholicism developed a very strong intellectual tradition. So I'm not talking about Catholicism in Spain itself. But here in the Philippines, aside from the elite who could go into the University of Santo Tomas, into the colleges, who were able to learn religion there, Filipino Catholics were generally taught a Catholicism that appealed a lot to the heart, but didn't really catechize the head that much. So that's one of the things I've noticed. And we're seeing the effects, for example, in Latin America, where the Protestants are making strong inroads. Mabuti na lang, here in the Philippines, we don't yet have that massive falling away to Protestantism. But still, you have this tendency in, I think, no, you still have this tendency in the Philippines na even though we are nominally Catholic, we are Catholics in the heart, we are not really, Catholics in the head. So I think this is one of the weaknesses na hindi talaga na solusyonan ng simbahan ever since. The second thing is Spanish Catholicism, as brought to the Philippines, had a very strong emphasis on piety, but not so much on the liturgy per se. From the texts of the liturgy and from the rites of the liturgy, in Spanish Catholicism, as brought to the Philippines, there was a tendency to treat the Mass simply as another kind of devotion, not really important, not really, you can say, the font of Christian piety. So I think those are the strengths and the weaknesses.
Next question is, what was the difference between the Augustinians and the Augustinian Recollects?
The Augustinians, as you know, came here in the Philippines in 1565 with Fray Andres de Urdaneta. The Recollects came much later in 1606. The main difference between them was the intensity with which they lived their life of asceticism. The word recollect is related to the word recollection. So the Augustinian Recollects were basically Augustinians who lived a life of greater asceticism and a life of greater recollection compared to the Calced or the ordinary Augustinians. Actually, another term for them in those days was the Calced Augustinians. So yung mga OSA o Augustinians, they were sometimes known as the Calced. Ibig sabihin ng Calced, naka-shoes or shod. Kasi pag sinabi mong discalced, naka-sandalias lang. So the Calced Augustinians, like the Calced Carmelites, wore shoes. But then, that's more to do with how they were like in Europe. But in practice, the Augustinian Recollects, their emphasis was on greater prayer. I remember reading that in the 17th century, for example, the Augustinian Recollects practiced as much as 4 hours of mental prayer every day. The Augustinians, if I'm not mistaken, did 2. They did 2 hours a day. So yung Recollects were much more ascetical. Although by the 19th century, that difference had largely disappeared. The irony, of course, is until 1912, the Augustinian Recollects were technically part of the same order as the Augustinians. They were simply a separate jurisdiction in the same order. But in 1912, the Recollects became fully a separate order.
Okay. Brother Kaloy, wait lang po. Okay. So the next question would be, is it true that the Franciscans and Dominicans in the Philippines were not corrupt and were in fact stricter compared to their counterparts elsewhere?
There is a book called The Friars of the Philippines by Father Ambrose Coleman, which claimed that only around 2%, I think, 2% of friars had broken their vows in the Philippines. Now, though that was friars in general. My point is, there were always some friars who were not accredited to the religious orders, na nakakommit ng mga abuses, na nakakommit ng mga violations ng kanilang vows. But the vast majority, by any measure, were loyal to their vows. And this is important because the Franciscans and the Dominicans have been really demonized, partly because of the Noli Me Tangere and the El Filibusterismo, kasi sila yung mga praile doon. The Franciscans in the Philippines were actually part of the group called the Alcantarin or Discalced Franciscans. They no longer exist. Kasi in 1897, the Discalced or Alcantarin Franciscans were among the different branches of the Franciscan order that were united into what is now known as the OFM or the Order of Friars Minor. So prior to 1897, ngayon kasi 'di ba, alam natin may OFM, may OFM conventual, may OFM Capuchin. So may Capuchin, may conventual, let's meron yung plain Franciscano, OFM. Yung OFM ngayon was formed from the Alcantarin or Discalced Franciscans, the Reformed Franciscans, the Recollect Franciscans. Yeah, there were actually Franciscan Recollects before, no? And of course, yung isang grupo, yung mga Observantine or OFM Franciscans talaga na walang qualifications. So you have these four groups, the OFM Observantines, the Recollects, the Alcantarins, and the Reformed being united in one branch. Until 1897, the Alcantarins were different. And they had been founded by Saint Peter of Alcantara, who was one of the great ascetics of the Counter-Reformation in Spain in the 1600s. He was one of the saints who inspired Saint Teresa of Avila. And he was known for his extreme asceticism. Like, he would sleep only 1.5 hours a day. Tapos, their cells were extremely narrow. Ang tawag nga para daw mga libingan, yung kanilang mga cells na tinutuluyan sa kanilang mga monasteries. Although that level of rigor did not last during the entire time the Alcantarins were around, the Alcantarin Franciscans were known to have retained severe asceticism all the time. They had to practice 3 to 4 hours of mental prayer, and they had to practice severe mortifications, self-flagellation. In fact, yung practice ng self-flagellation sa Pilipinas, nakuha natin yan from 2 religious orders, the Jesuits and the Franciscans. And then yung Alcantarins, probably their best legacy is the religiosity of the Bicolano people, because the Bicol region was assigned to the Franciscans. And it so happens that the Franciscans were the only religious, or the only major religious order, or the only religious order in the Philippines that did not have haciendas. Wala silang mga hacienda. And they also had exceptionally good relationships with the diocesan or the secular clergy na Filipino, na Indio, or Mestizo in Bicol. Kaya when the revolution broke out in the Philippines in 1896, Bicol was actually the place where the secular clergy were most content. They handled 50% of all the parishes kasi mabait sa kanila yung mga friar bishops, yung mga Franciscans, mabait sa kanila. And that's also probably one of the reasons why to this day Bicol is the most religious part of the Philippines. Kasi wala sa history ng Bicol yung bitterness o yung grievances na na-implant against the Catholic Church in the Ilocos or the Tagalog regions. Yun. Wala yun sa Bicol. So, we owe that to the Franciscans. So, generally, although I'm pretty sure there were Franciscans who violated their vows, hindi po natin masasabi na they were corrupted. As far as you can tell, to the very end of Spanish rule, the Spanish Franciscans, the Alcantarin Franciscans in the Philippines were very loyal, were very ascetical, very spiritual. if people will go now to San Francisco del Monte, which is now a basilica, no? Dun sa San Pedro Bautista Basilica in San Francisco del Monte, Quezon City, they can ask to see the Santa Cueva. It's under the church. It's now been renovated, but it's the location, or rather it's located above the cave where the Franciscan Alcantarin Saint San Pedro Bautista used to pray, kasi he was a missionary in the Philippines for 9 years. So there. That's for the Franciscans. For the Dominicans, it is said in the 17th century that the Dominican convent, or the Dominican monastery, or the Dominican friary rather, in Intramuros, was the strictest Dominican priory in the entire world. Yung practice nila of prayer and asceticism was considered to be stricter in Intramuros than anywhere else. And that's not a surprise. That's not a surprise because the friars of the Most Holy Rosary province, which was the Dominican province that controlled the Philippines, were missionary friars. They were assigned to be mission workers in Japan, in China, in Vietnam. So they were friars who had to be ready for martyrdom. And we know that many of them were martyred in Japan in the 17th century, in China and in Vietnam in the 18th and the 19th centuries. So martyrdom was never far away from the Spanish Dominicans here. Okay, we need to keep that in mind. They were not at all just comfortable in their friaries, doing nothing, enjoying the tributes. Hindi ganon. Many of them wanted to be missionaries, and many of them actually faced and suffered martyrdom. So in order to keep themselves ready for martyrdom, their practice of spirituality, their practice of asceticism, their practice of prayer in the monastery, or rather the friary of Intramuros, the Santo Domingo Friary in Intramuros, had to be very high. So yun yung makita natin na the Dominicans and the Franciscans, although there may have been some friars who did not observe their vows, all in all, they were apparently of very high discipline here in the Philippines.
Okay. So next question would be, what was the attitude towards the sciences of the Spanish Empire and of the friars and the religious orders in the Philippines?
Much of our thoughts, much of our ideas about, much of our ideas about the friars in the Philippines, yung kanilang attitude to science, to the sciences, have been poisoned by the way Jose Rizal portrayed the class in physics in UST, in his El Filibusterismo, which was nothing short of libelous, to be honest, because that's not how physics was taught in UST. There's a whole book by Father Fidel Villaruel called Rizal and the University of Santo Tomas, which debunks that, and pointed out that although University of Santo Tomas in the 19th century was not on the same par as the universities in Spain, for the simple reason that Manila was so far away. And syempre, ang layo-layo natin, so hindi, kumbaga, they had to do with what they had. They did not have the resources to match or to surpass the universities in Spain, but they did what they could. And they had a complete physics laboratory, and they had a very complete biological museum, or they had a complete museum of natural history, which is still in UST, if I'm not mistaken. Kasi a few years ago, whether nakita ko pa yung mga specimens from the Spanish era. So their attitude, the attitude of the religious orders, the sciences, was, of course, they valued the faith most of all, but they also valued the sciences. Perhaps the best in valuing the sciences were, of course, the Jesuits. We know about how the Jesuits in 1865 founded the Manila Observatory. They found the Manila Observatory, which had, among other things, different departments for astronomy, for meteorology, and for seismology. So, yung seismology was very important because earthquakes were a real and present danger in the Philippines during the Spanish era kasi the way buildings here were constructed were medyo flimsy. Meteorology was important because they had to be able to predict typhoons. Father Federico Faura, the Jesuit who led the Manila Observatory from 1865 until 1897, he even invented his own barometer, the so-called Faura barometer, and it became famous just this year. Kasi nung typhoon, nung isa sa mga bagyo na dumaan nung Nobyembre, there was an antique barometer, an antique Faura barometer that came to life. No? Na-detect niya yung parating na typhoon. And nakatanda yung barometer na yun, far more than a century na, and yet it was still working. No? So you have the Jesuits in Manila Observatory. That's one of the best proofs of the strength of science in the Philippines. And even the Augustinians, not many people realize that the Augustinians established a school of arts and trades in Malabon in 1890, no, the Asilo de Huerfanos in 1890, and they were taught their practical sciences. So the friars, to the extent that their educating mission dictated it, they were very supportive of the sciences. And of course, marami rin mga famous scientists, prison scientist friars dito. You have Father Manuel Blanco, who came up, who cataloged the flora of the Philippines. You have Father Casto de Helera, a Dominican, who cataloged the fauna of the Philippines. Mga multi-volume collections po ito, no, ng mga iba't ibang flora in the case of Manuel Blanco and fauna in the case of Father Casto de Helera, was a Dominican. Si Father Manuel Blanco, Augustinian. You have Father George Camel, Jesuit, who was into medicinal plants. No? And so you can say that the friars, the religious orders, were definitely supportive of the sciences. They were not at all the ignorant barbarians that our educational system likes to portray them to be.
Okay. Next question is, can you discuss Intramuros and why it is so important to Philippine history and culture?
When Intramuros was founded, of course, no, as the capital city of the Captain Generalcy of the Philippines, it was also intended to be a kind of little Rome. It was the jumping point for all Spanish missionary work in Asia. The Portuguese missionaries jumped off from Goa in India. The Spanish missionaries jumped off from Manila in the Philippines. That's why Intramuros in Manila had so many churches. Right? It had the churches of the iba't ibang religious orders. It was because this was their jump off point. So it was not just the political realm, but also spiritual realm. And if you're going to look at Intramuros, it's grid-like, very regular streets. It is also an example of a Renaissance city in the tropics. Kasi yung Renaissance saw the revival of Roman ideas about city planning and architecture, and part of it was the emphasis on regular grids, order in the city. And this was most of all a reflection of the medieval, the Renaissance, and actually Catholic emphasis on the idea of order, the importance of order in the urban city, yung na merong specific importance sa mga iba't ibang buildings are indicated by their place in the whole city. Kaya meron yung centrality ng simbahan, along with the palace of the Governor General sa tabi niya, along Plaza. It showed, in particular, the close harmony, the close union between church and state. So you can say that Intramuros was like a microcosm of the Spanish vision of how the world should be. A world of order governed by church and state working in harmony with each other. But spiritually speaking, it was the church that was dominant. Kaya yung aside from the dominance of the churches, the fact that you had the great Manila Cathedral towering over everything else would have served as a reminder that spiritual realities were the most important for them. In contrast, when the Americans came, their city planning did not really take into account in churches. So, doon mo makita yung difference of perspective between the Americans and the Spaniards.
Okay. Next question. Did Dr. Jose Rizal really retract? What are the evidences of his retraction?
I hope to be able to give a more in-depth talk about the retraction of Rizal in 2021. As part of the series of talks that I plan to give on details of Philippine church history. Yung talk ko ngayon is supposed to be supposed to be an introduction lang an introductory into various topics. Kumbaga panimula lang ito. But I'm really intending a series throughout 2021 to discuss various issues, and one of the issues I plan to discuss at length is the retraction of Rizal. But if one has to look for you can say, in a nutshell na sagot, there are, I would say, 3 easy answers about the retraction of Rizal, which for us proves na it really happened. First and foremost is the fact that he was buried in consecrated ground. There are a lot of misunderstandings about Paco Cemetery. Paco Cemetery, of course, was it was commissioned by the government as a response to deaths from plague, but it was still consecrated ground. It was a place where Catholics were buried. That's why when Apolinario Mabini died in 1903, since he died a Freemason, he was buried in what is now the Binondo Chinese Cemetery because he could not be buried in a Catholic cemetery. Now, if Rizal was not, remember, when Rizal was executed in 1896, December 30, 1896, the Spaniards wanted to hide his body. Okay, they wanted to hide his body. And yet, if they really wanted to hide his body and he died not a Catholic, it would have been the easiest thing for them to throw him into a common grave somewhere or to bury him in the Chinese cemetery, which was the cemetery for heathens. And yet, they didn't do it. Instead, they buried him in a tiny cemetery, the Paco Cemetery, where his grave was actually found easily later. O kaya nga, na-recover yung katawan niya after 1898. Or rather, namarkahan yung libingan niya after 1898. Kasi it was such a small area. It was not very difficult to find it, where it had been buried. So, that tells us that the Spaniards had a consideration higher than the need to hide his body. And what could that be? If you put 2 and 2 together, if you put things together, they needed to hide his body, but they had to bury him in a tiny cemetery that was also consecrated. So that tells us that the higher importance was given to burying his body in consecrated ground, which could have been done only if he was Catholic. Minsan, ang palusot ng mga Freemasons is, yun daw na bendisyonan lang sa Paco Cemetery ay yung walls, pero hindi yung ground. There's no evidence for that kind of hair splitting. Either a cemetery is blessed or it is not. The practice in Catholic cemeteries, when the distinction between consecrated and unconsecrated ground was still being kept, was that if you had to have a section for unconsecrated burials, it was definitely separate from the rest of the Catholic cemetery. Hindi siya nasa gitna o yung ground na linalakaran. Hindi yon. That's really separate from the rest. So, Paco Cemetery was a consecrated cemetery. Rizal was buried there, so it points to him being Catholic, number 1. Number 2, we know that once the Spaniards had left, requiem masses were celebrated for Rizal. You had a requiem mass in Malolos, for example, on December 30, 1898, which was attended by about 1,000 soldiers. In Manila itself, it is said that in 1898, all of the churches had requiem masses on December 30 for Jose Rizal. So that points to Rizal dying as a Catholic being considered as public knowledge. And the fact is, the Freemasons could have challenged it at the time. They did not. That Freemasonic challenges to the retraction of Rizal came only much later. But in 1898, no one was challenging it kasi it was considered as public knowledge, unchallenged fact. And finally, probably yung best witness is a witness from the you can say hostile witness, yung pinakamaganda. In 1903, in an event now forgotten by a lot of Filipinos, the Iglesia Filipina Independiente canonized canonized the Gomburza and Jose Rizal. So the Aglipayans actually canonized Jose Rizal in 1903. And one of the arguments, or rather one of the things that they said in their decree of canonization is that Rizal died with the sacraments, with the final sacraments. He received the last sacraments. The Aglipayans would have had no reason to say that unless if it were true. Kasi the Aglipayans were allied with the Freemasons. They were very anti-Catholic. They wanted to bring Catholics away from the church. So, kaya nga hostile witness. Kasi despite being hostile to the Catholic Church, they still ended up admitting that he received the last rites from the Catholic Church. And again, this was just 7 years after Rizal had been executed. So it was public knowledge at the time. It was only much later when the immediacy of the execution of Rizal had disappeared that the Freemasons began challenging the retraction of Rizal.
Okay. The next question is, what can we say to the Aglipayans when they say that the IFI is the last remaining fruit of the Philippine Revolution, and that to be truly nationalist, you have to be Aglipayan?
Madalas tong mabanggit, no? Although not as frequently now as before. I used to read articles from the 70s and the 80s and the 90s na sinasabi na kaya daw hindi ganun kadami ang mga Aglipayan sa Pilipinas ay hindi daw kasi patriotiko or hindi daw nationalist ang mga Pilipino masyado. And that's absurd. First and foremost, as I mentioned before, there were Catholic priests who were in favor of the revolution. No? Without in any way judging whether they were doctrinally correct or not, because that's not really a judgment that they can make. Pwede nating sabihin na they died as good Catholics. So they did not see any need to leave the Catholic Church in order to be revolutionary or in order to be revolutionaries. Pangalawa, yung masasabi natin na argument na you have to be part of a nationalist church in order to be nationalist. Ultimately, ang tanong dyan is, when we are discussing membership in a church, we are not supposed to ask about national affiliation. We are not supposed to ask about national affiliation. Wala namang sinabi sa Ebanghelyo na each country should have its own church. In fact, Christ said, when he was speaking to Peter, you are Peter, and upon this rock I will build my church. Iisa yung church na pinag-uusapan, hindi national church. So, yung nationalism, walang kinalaman yan dapat sa ating pagiging Pilipino. And also, no, aside from the Philippine Revolution, is the fact that so many heroes are Catholics. So many Filipino heroes who have died for this country are Catholics. Although hindi ko na napag-usapan kanina, during the Filipino-American War, many priests, especially in the Visayas, were actually killed by the Americans because of their loyalty to the Philippine government. And they were not Aglipayan priests, they were Catholic priests. Kasi people frequently forget that the Aglipayan Church was founded only in 1902. Tapos na po yung Philippine Revolution in most of the Philippines. So, the idea that in order to be nationalist, you have to be Aglipayan is untrue. On the contrary, we Catholics can point to events such as EDSA 1986, where the Catholic Church played a leading role in overthrowing the dictatorship of Marcos. So for me, that's a form of patriotism. The late Teddy Benigno, the late columnist Teddy Benigno, once said that the EDSA revolution of 1986 was the final reconciliation between the ideals of the Philippine Revolution and the ideals of the Catholic Church. I don't want to cast judgment on that theology, on that idea. I'm not saying that Teddy Benigno was right or wrong, but he was touching on an important reality that the Catholic Church, whatever you may think about its past, is fully part, you can say, of the Filipino spirit. No, hindi siya alien sa pagiging Pilipino.
Next question. You have helped design the Defensores Today pilgrimages to all churches since 2012. Although we were not able to hold it in 2020, what can you say about the old churches that you have visited and how they relate to our history?
Yung mga old churches kasi, may napansin akong paradox online. Sa mga iba't ibang discussion groups sa pinag-uusapan ng history ng Pilipinas, madalas i-demonize ang mga Kastila. Pero sine-celebrate din yung mga simbahan. Galit na galit tayo sa Kastila, pero tuwan-tuwa tayo dun sa mga simbahan na itinatag ng mga Kastila nung sila ay namumuno pa sa Pilipinas. Granted, though, it was with the labor of the Indios, but even then, much of that labor was demonstrably voluntary and paid. It's not as if they were enslaved to do the churches. No? So, para sa akin, una sa lahat, if we really are going to be proud of our churches, we should be consistent and also embrace our past. Hindi pwede yung titingin tayo sa ating mga old churches. Proud tayo sa mga old churches natin. Ginagawa natin mga tourist spot yung churches natin. Tapos kamumuhian natin yung mga Kastila. Whether we like it or not, it was the Spaniards who gave us the intellectual tools to erect these churches. So these churches are a tangible reminder of what we owe to the Spaniards. And it's also a tangible reminder of how Catholicism has raised our standards as a culture. As I pointed out kanina, there are no surviving major structures from before the Spanish era, and it does not seem that there were ever any. Even in the south, in the Muslim areas, yung kanilang mga mosques down to the late 19th and early 20th centuries tended to be just large made of wood wood and thatch. Kahit yung palasyo ng Sultan of Sulu was made of wood. It was the Spaniards who really taught us how to build these large stone structures. And why is this important? Kasi the building of large stone structures is usually a milestone of civilization. Pag ang isang kultura nakakagawa na ng mga malalaking mga stone structures, it is usually a sign that its civilizational development has reached great heights. And as Nick Joaquin also points out in his Culture and History, it is not possible that the Spaniards taught us how to build churches, how to build bridges, how to build large houses, yung ating mga pinagmamayabang na bahay na bato, without these skills also leaving their impression on the Filipino character. I would say na the building of churches, nakita niyo naman siguro, many of our churches are huge. In Taal, it's still the biggest church in the Church of Taal, built with coffee wealth in the 19th century, is still the biggest church in all of Asia hanggang ngayon. At the very least, it's the largest in the eastern portion of Asia. So the fact na we were able to do this, it also speaks a lot about the ability of the Filipino to dare. Kasi we were able to create this with the guidance of the friars, it's true. But the friars themselves were, by and large, not professional architects. So it was really a combination of yung designs, yung inspiration, yung intellect na dinala ng mga friars, but also a lot of the practical skill of the Filipino stone masons and the Filipino, you can say, laborers, who created these churches. So para sa akin, when I see the old churches, for me, it's a legacy of Spain, but it's also a testimony to Filipino bravery and ingenuity.
Next question is, in what way are old churches truly Filipino? Aren't they just colonial impositions, not really part of our history?
Yes, madalas kasing sabihin niya ng mga ilang nationalists na para sa kanila, yung mga simbahan, lang yan, foreign objects yan. But I don't think it makes sense. Like I've mentioned previously, una sa lahat, yung mga churches natin, hindi yan tawag dito, hindi naman yan pinarashoot mula sa Espanya, hindi naman yan in-import mula sa Espanya. They were built here. And they were built taking local conditions in mind, yung local materials, yung local weather. Kung napansin nyo nga, Spanish-era churches, with very rare exceptions, did not even have stained glass. They usually had large capiz windows. And this was because in order to let in sunlight, pero also para mabuksan sila for ventilation. So it was you can say, European forms, but transformed by Filipino needs. So at the very least, they are definitely marked by the Philippines. Kumbaga, hindi na sila Kastila lang. They're very Spanish, but they're also very Filipino.
So you have visited Spain in early 2020 to look at a shell collection that came from the Philippines. How is this significant and related to our history?
When I went to Spain early 2020, it was part of our research tour. And one of the places we visited was a town called Ferrol in the northwestern coast of Spain. It's a very small town, but it's located, it's very close, it's very relevant to the Philippines because it was the navy town from which naval expeditions would go to the Philippines. So yung Spanish Navy, pag pupunta sila sa Pilipinas, nanggagaling sila sa Ferrol madalas. Kung hindi sa Ferrol, sa Cadiz. So sa Ferrol, it's also one of the reasons, by the way, why we in the Philippines, we have pochero. Pochero, yung ulam na pochero. It's actually Galician in origin. It's from that part of Spain. Anyway, there was this admiral whose name was Claudio Montero. At si Claudio Montero, ang ginawa niya, he was assigned to the Philippines for several years. Part of his work was hydrography. So he surveyed yung coastal areas ng Pilipinas. He helped in the mapping of the Philippines. And while he was doing that, he also took the time to collect shells. And he was able to collect more than 1,000 shells. More than 1,000 shells. And because they were stored in northwestern Spain, na napakalamig, the shells, their colors have been preserved very well. It is probably the most beautiful Philippine shell collection outside of the Philippines itself. And yung shell collection na ganun kaluma, no, from the 1800s, no, from the 1860s. Nung tinitingnan ko yung shells, they looked good as new. Talagang ganun ka-fresh yung colors. In contrast, if those shells had remained in the Philippines, baka matagal na nag-crumble o nag-fade yung mga shells na yon. At least in Spain, they had been preserved. So why is this important? Kasi it also shows a little-known part of our history. Yung pong mga Kastila, they were also deeply scientific. No? They also had deep scientific interests. In fact, we know that, that in the 19th century, Spanish military and naval officers were trained in the sciences. No? It was really part of the vision of the Spanish Bourbon kings. So they wanted to have a military, they wanted to have a military force led by officers who were not just officers, but were also scholars. They were also scientific scholars. And once you realize that, you realize na yung links natin with Spain were not just political, were not just religious, they were also scientific. Kaya nga yung Spain, mahilig yung mga Kastila in vast scientific expeditions. If you go, for example, to the front of Manila Cathedral, may makikita kang malaking statue doon, the statue of King Charles IV. And the statue of King Charles IV is there to commemorate his ordering the smallpox vaccine to be brought to the Philippines. It was a truly massive humanitarian work for that time. Kasi the vaccine had to travel for several years. No? But in the end, it reached the Philippines and it helped combat the growth. It helped combat smallpox in our country. So nandun yung interest in science, in medicine, in anything about flora and fauna. So we have that shell collection that I saw in Spain was a reminder of that scientific link between Spain and the Philippines.
Can you discuss Holy Week? How was Holy Week like during the Spanish era, and how is this different from Holy Week today?
Okay. I would like to go to this discussion because I think it's important to understand how Holy Week was like during the Spanish era in order to understand our Holy Week traditions today. Yung ating mga tradition ngayon, hindi mo maintindihan kung hindi mo naintindihan the way Holy Week worked before. First and foremost, Holy Week during the Spanish era, the liturgical ceremonies were celebrated in the morning. Okay? They were celebrated in the morning. Yung alam natin ngayon na yung Easter Vigil sa gabi, yung ritual ng Good Friday, yung Veneration of the Cross, ginagawa siya at 3 p.m. Yung Holy Thursday, ginagawa siya. Yung Mass of Holy Thursday, ginagawa circa 5 or 6 p.m. That came into force only in the 1950s, in 1956 to be exact. Kasi prior to that, the liturgical ceremonies were celebrated in the morning. So yung seremonya ng Holy Thursday, yung Mass of Holy Thursday, yung Mass commemorating the Last Supper, and the reposition of the Blessed Sacrament, celebrate yun in the morning of Holy Thursday. Yung celebration ng Good Friday, yung Veneration of the Cross, ginagawa yun morning of Good Friday. At yung Easter Vigil, celebrate siya actually morning of morning of Black Saturday. Kaya dati, 6 a.m. pa lang ng Black Saturday, nag-Easter Vigil na sila minsan, no, in some places. Now, because of this, maintindihan natin yung term na Sabado de Gloria. Kasi, di ba, sa Easter Vigil, kinakanta yung Gloria in Excelsis Deo. Glory to God in the highest. So, pag ang Easter Vigil, sineselebrate mo in the morning of Black Saturday, then, in practice, yung Gloria is heard on Black Saturday. Diba? Kaya, yung Sabado de Gloria, kaya yung Black Saturday is Sabado de Gloria kasi until 1955, in practice, sa Black Saturday, kinakanta yung Gloria in Excelsis Deo. Ngayon, nawala na yung memory nun. Kaya, pag nagkakaroon ng mga explanations no, bakit ba ang Gloria, ba't ang Sabado de Gloria, ganyan ang ang ganyan ang pangalan, minsan nakakarinig ako ng mga kung ano-anong contrived na explanations tulad ng ang Gloria ay kaya daw Sabado de Gloria kasi that Black Saturday was glorious, yung mga ganong explanations. So hindi po ganon. The real explanation is in Black Saturday until 1955, Black Saturday was actually the morning of Black Saturday was actually the morning on which Easter Vigil was celebrated. Yun namang Good Friday, yung pag-celebrate ng umaga, yung pag-celebrate ng Veneration of the Cross ng Good Friday in the morning is one of the reasons also why meron tayong mga iba't ibang practices katulad nung tawag dito, yung Siete Palabras, na traditionally, ang Siete Palabras, naka-unveil yung crucifix, di ba? Wala nakatakip. Ang nangyayari kasi ngayon, pag sineselebrate yung Siete Palabras, walang takip yung crucifix, naka-expose. Tapos, para dun sa liturgy na susunod, tatakpan ulit. Pero prior to 1955, yung mga krus, tinanggal na yung kanilang veil nung umaga pala ng Good Friday. Kaya pagdating ng Siete Palabras, naka-unveil na siya. Tapos in many places, although in some places like in some parts of Pampanga and Bulacan, and even here in Metro Manila, ginagawa pa rin to, may tinatawag na ritual called the tanggal, na yung after ng Siete Palabras, ceremonially, parang tinatanggal yung katawan dun sa crucifix, yung katawan ng Kristo dun sa crucifix. Tapos para siyang ceremonially na binabalot at linilibing. Okay. So that's part of the Good Friday procession. Hanggang ngayon, yung practice natin na may Santo Enchero sa Good Friday procession is a relic of that practice. And finally, yung Holy Thursday, madalas ko naririnig to pag Holy Thursday, nagrereklamo. Bakit ang mga tao nagbibisita iglesia sila in the morning of Holy Saturday? Bakit hindi sila nagbibisita iglesia in the evening of Holy Saturday? And one of the reasons for that is, dati nga kasi, yung misa ng the Holy Thursday, no? Dati kasi, yung misa ng Holy Thursday, sineselebrate siya in the morning of Holy Thursday. So by Holy Thursday morning, yung pong mga monumento o yung mga altars of repose, nakatayo na siya all over, no? Sa mga iba't ibang simbahan. So pwede na magbisita iglesia ng umaga ng Holy Thursday. After 1955, the Mass of the Last Supper and the repose of the Blessed Sacrament ay na-move na to the evening of Holy Thursday. Pero yung nakagawian ng mga tao na sa umaga nagpupunta ng bisita iglesia ay nanatili. It's one of those examples na para maintindihan mo ang isang bagay na nakagawian, dapat alam mo rin kung ano yung ginagawa dati ng simbahan prior to Vatican II, and in this case actually na embed nung panahon ng mga Kastila. So those are just some examples.
What can you say about our devotion to the Passion of the Christ and the Christ Child? Is it true that these devotions have had a major influence on our character?
Well, ang isang ang isang thesis dyan, in broad terms, is dahil sa passion, lalo sa ating devotion sa Passion of Christ, we began to identify ourselves as like the suffering Christ. No, patient, enduring everything. I think there is some truth to that. No? Kasi in Christianity, we are taught to imitate Christ. At kung ang ating portrayal of Christ na madalas natin makita is the crucified Christ or Christ who has suffered from the passion, syempre, that's going to influence the way we think of kung na dapat yung ating imitation kay Christ. So imitating Him in His humility, imitating Him in His patience despite all sufferings is part and parcel of our identity, I think. At the same time, para sa akin, this is not a bad thing. This is a good thing kasi it teaches us patience and it teaches us also an understanding of kumbaga an appreciation for the cost of what Christ suffered for our souls. In the same way, yung devotion natin sa Santo Niño, sa Christ Child, sometimes it has been abused. Napapansin ko nga lately yung tendency na yung mga Santo Niño ginagawang parang doll, kung ano sinusuot. No? But I think that that's not necessarily, that does not necessarily show malice. No? It simply means that they have to be catechized better. Yung mga taong gumagawa nito. But the important thing is in our devotion to Christ Child, we are made to understand that Christ is truly loving, tender, gentle, very near, like a little child. Dapat nating lapitan. So the Passion of Christ and of course, last but not least, sabi ni Cristo, na we must be childlike. So the Passion of Christ and the Santo Niño are two poles of the humanity of Christ, and they teach us how to be like Christ.
So are movies like Rizal and Valer accurate in their portrayal of the church?
No. So, yung Rizal, nalala ko noong 1997, di ba? At that time, it was celebrated as probably the greatest Filipino movie daw of that time. Well, it was great in some ways. I think it was a laudable effort, but their research on the church was extremely lousy. I remember that movie very well. Naalala ko, pinagmayabang pa ng mga producers ng movie na yon na they were so meticulous in their research na ultimo daw yung coins na ginamit doon sa ilang scenes doon, authentic na ginaya yung Spanish era coins nung sa Pilipinas. Even though doon sa film mismo, hindi ba naman makikita masyado yung coins Pero ganun daw sila ka-authentic. Tapos yung mga damit daw, authentic, talaga ginaya nila yung the way the clothes would have looked like in the 1890s. But they neglected to do that for the church vestments. Yung suot ng pare, dun, may isang scene doon na may elevation of the host by the priest, mali yung suot yung damit. He was wearing a cope, not a chasuble. He was supposed to wear a chasuble, not a cope. I'm sure many of our listeners here would know the distinction between a chasuble and a cope. Yung cope is kapa. Hindi naman sinusuot ang kapa sa misa Susuot yung parang chasuble, yung anong time na yun, shaped like a guitar. Para siyang two flaps na shaped like a guitar front and back. And naalala ko rin yung habit ng mga Dominicans doon, mali. Yung scapularyo ng mga Dominicans, itim. Doon sa movie, dapat puti. But most seriously, I think, was they got a lot of things wrong. First and foremost, the friars were always portrayed there as really malicious or malignant. Like yung opening scene doon, na si Jose Burgos, pinakita siya nagtititili para siyang baboy nakakatayin habang sumisigaw. Tapos pagkatapos may priale sa tabi na sinabi na gina-justify yung pagpatay dun sa mga tatlong pare. In fact, the priests were not allowed to be there at all. And the church itself opposed the execution of the Gomburza. Kaya nga, when the Gomburza were being executed, the church bells were being rung in solemn protest at the execution of these priests. Tapos yung portrayal doon din kay Bernardino Nozaleda was extremely off. Nozaleda is shown there na mayabang, babading-bading. It didn't help that Pekka Galiaga was the one who portrayed him. So, the way Nozaleda was portrayed there was nothing short of slanderous. In fact, he was a man who, syempre, he was a loyal Spaniard. He was loyal to his crown. But there is no proof that he was ever brutal, was ever cruel. In fact, we know now when Rizal was about to be executed, he ordered all of the monasteries in Intramuros to have the exposition of the Blessed Sacrament to pray for the conversion of Rizal. So that said something about his concern for Rizal's eternal welfare. Yun namang Baler, may isang weird na passage doon na gusto daw ng mga tao magsimba doon sa simbahan ng Baler. At sinabihan sila nung isang officer na magpunta daw sila doon sa Iglesia Independiente. Ang weird lang doon, noong 1899, wala pa namang Iglesia Filipina Independiente noon. The Iglesia Filipina Independiente was founded in 1902. Now, it's a good thing that these two movies were mentioned kasi napapansin ko, there's a really huge blind spot when it comes to our cinematographers, when it comes to our film directors, and in fact, when it comes to our historians. Ang hilig-hilig nilang mag-research na napaka-meticulous about all sorts of things, but when it comes to the church, they don't even bother to do their basic research. Just the other day, I was going through Kasaysayan, the 10-volume history of the Philippines that was published in 1898. That was published in 1998. It's 10 volumes. It's meticulously researched, supposedly. And yet it mentions na in the 1700s daw, Filipino priests, Indio priests in the Philippines had no access to the Bible. Parang nangyaring walang access ang mga pari dito to the Bible? Ang reason na binigay is kasi nung time daw na yun, wala namang Spanish Bible. Well, Filipino priests, first and foremost, must have been taught Latin. So they would have read the Bible in Latin, not in Spanish. Until the 20th century, if you were a priest, you were expected to know the Bible in Latin, not in the vernacular. Pangalawa, even if for the sake of argument, walang Biblia yung mga pare, each priest cannot function at all as a priest without two books. The Missal, in order to celebrate Mass, and the Breviary, mas kilala ngayon bilang Liturgy of the Hours. And yung Missal at yung Breviary are full of readings from the Bible. So they would definitely have had access to the texts of the Gospels and to the text of the Bible. And these are just one of the many, many misconceptions about the church that you will find in all sorts of places. No? As pagdating sa mga movies natin, when portraying the church, forget about it, forget about accuracy. So I think this is one of the reasons why Filipino Catholic apologists, or anyone who's simply interested, need to learn more about history. For the record though, although nabanggit kanina ni Sir Henry na my own actual field of specialty is philosophy, my minor in UP was in Philippine history. So my major is philosophy, my minor is Philippine history. So I'm actually in, so Philippine history is really one of my, shall we say, one of my great loves. And I hope to be able to explore it in further talks in 2021. Yun.
So the last question that was emailed to us is it true that we are poor because we are Catholic?
Well, that's usually one of the talking points against the Catholic Church in the Philippines. Kaya daw tayo mahirap kasi Katoliko tayo. But it does not explain two things. First and foremost, we may be rather poor now compared to other Asian and ASEAN countries. But there was a time when the Philippines was one of the most advanced countries in Asia. And this was within living memory in the 1960s. And the Philippines was much more Catholic then than it is now. So if Catholicism did not prevent the Philippines from being relatively prosperous then, there is no reason Catholicism should prevent us from being relatively prosperous now. I think what has happened is too many Filipinos simply don't live by the faith. And really, I think what brings down, what helps us to, what keeps us poor is not a religion. It's our attitudes, which are not really dependent on religion. Otherwise, if it were dependent on religion, dapat lahat ng mga devout Catholics naghihirap. Which is not true. There are many hardworking Catholics who enjoy the fruit of their labor, who are relatively prosperous. There are also Catholics who, for one reason or another, are poor, but it's not because of their religion. So I can say you can extrapolate that to the rest of the Philippines and say na it's not because of our religion that we are poor.
So now I'll be mentioning questions from the chat box.
Can you give me 2 minutes first? Kasi I need to. Okay. Sige.
Okay.
Eric, I'll take up that 2 minutes, no? Eric.
Sir Henry?
Yes. Kaloy did mention about the Intramuros. There was a plan before by Defensores to have a walking tour sa Intramuros. Siguro once it is safe to go out sa Intramuros, maybe we can hold a walking tour, just like what I posted earlier sa Intramuros tayo. Para basta safe na. Wala na tong threat of COVID virus. And so it's gonna be faith and culture tour. So it's a one-day tour. Kasi Kaloy, you always say that the Intramuros is where the saint walk, no? So madaming nag-seminar, madaming tumirang mga santo na martyr sa Intramuros. So I think Kaloy is quite familiar with the area. Would you like that, guys? You can unmute kung gusto niyo mag-comment.
Yes daw po, coming from Brother Gerald.
Yeah, oo.
Yes, coming from Jackie Usigan.
Aside from that, meron ako na-discover na very good restaurant sa tabi ng San Agustin. Talagang gastronomical. Sana ma-survive nila tong Sana ma-survive nitong COVID at that will be a good as with our pilgrimages, pinipili natin masarap na. It's good for the mind, for the heart, and the stomach. Imagine we hit three organs. Sige. Kasi Kaloy will not settle for anything less. Kailangan masarap ang pagkain.
Yes, indeed. So that was a nice idea. So hopefully lift na tong pinagdadaanan po natin for COVID. So na tayo. Makapag-gala-gala na.
Saka fellowship din natin. Siguro doon tayo time na face-to-face tayo.
Yes, Sir Henry.
There was also a suggestion that next year, kung meron pa tayong ganitong klaseng seminar, is to invite foreign speakers like the like of Tim Staples, Steve Ray, or maybe Trent Horn. I don't know, Patrick Madrid maybe. So that would be nice. Parang kakasama natin siguro ang empower Philippines to do that. Si Steve Ray and Tim Staples are quite familiar with the Philippines because they've been here before. Dito lang sila naka-experience magbigay ng talk sa sabungan. I don't know, that's a trivia, parang baka hindi nyo alam. We went to Bacolod as an invitation of Mrs. Gretchen Coangco on, I forgot if it's either her birthday. And then yung venue ng talk namin sa sabungan nila. So, only in the Philippines. Hello, let me know if you're back, ha? Kamusta na yung sound audio natin? Yung sound, okay naman?
Better na, Sir Henry, I think.
Better? Oo.
Yes.
What I did was I used an external speaker, yung Bluetooth. So sa akin walang issue from my end, malinaw na malinaw. So while waiting for Brother Kaloy, next week we'll have a special session again. It will be the first. We'll have 5 converts to share with us their conversion story.
All right.
Brother Kaloy, maybe for the break, can you announce who are these brothers and sisters in the faith? Maki-share next week.
Teka, wala sa harap ko yung
kodigo mo. Pero
yung kodigo.
I remember Brother Noah kasama ba?
Hindi.
Hindi. Si INC
si June Correa. Bale, okay.
June Correa.
Yung isang former INC, I'm really sorry. My mind is a bit blank right now. No? Like wala yung kodigo ko eh. So, then si June Correa, who is a former Baptist and the son of a pastor.
Let me correct you on that. Ayaw ni June former pastor, the chairman of the Southern Baptist Conference.
Sorry. Okay, yun. So,
yeah. No, putting in the right now.
Si Burns Kaasi, who is dating born again.
Okay.
Si Bem Sabanal, who is dating Adventist.
Oh yes, naging estudyante natin yan si Bem.
Yes. At si Ito problema when I give long talks, minsan nabablanko ko eh. And we have another giving talks, siya, always remained a Catholic, pero at one point naging skeptic siya.
Okay.
So in-invite ko siya kasi si Rodney De Leon, para mapag-usapan yung siya. Kasi we often think of converts as simply being non-Catholics becoming or returning to the Catholic Church. But sometimes conversion can be just as profound among Catholics who did not believe.
Mm.
or who were not firm in their faith, tapos bumalik sila tapos nagkaroon sila ng mas firm at mas strong na faith. So yun ang natin, yun ang isa sa mga guests natin, and I invited him precisely to do that. Sensya na,
Okay,
medyo napapaos na ako eh. So,
Di ba? Yung format, pag-usapan na lang natin, or it will be it's like a sofa, sala set of interview,
Yeah, yeah.
or okay.
yeah,
Sige.
let's arrange it.
Back to you.
Okay, so may mga questions pa. Actually, sa totoo lang, no, I stopped halfway through my talk. May meron pa akong, can you just show briefly yung slideshow? I'll just show it, So,
Sure.
I had an entire part pa about saintly Filipinos. Hindi ko na napag-usapan, completely nawala na sa discussion. So I will not be discussing this anymore, but those who want to have a copy of this can have a copy of the slides. And at any rate, saints who live in the Philippines and saintly Filipinos are among my passions. So they are among my great interests. In fact, I had been hoping to write my first book about them. So you will hear more about them in the next year.
Actually, Kaloy, when you were out, I was telling them that the participants that we might have a walking tour of the Intramuros. And so it's a faith and culture, but eventually I discovered a good restaurant by San Agustin.
Syempre,
So,
dapat importante yun. Necessary.
So we fill up our brain, our heart, and our stomach. Imagine in one day. Plus fellowship.
Nakwento mo ba na when we were having our Lenten pilgrimages for Defensores? So kami, when we have our Lenten pilgrimages for Defensores, usually ang style namin, we look for a restaurant first. We look for the restaurant first. Tapos yung ruta, what churches to actually visit, we plot them around the location of the restaurant. So, kasi kailangan, syempre, masarap yung makain ng mga pilgrims. At masarap yung makain namin. So yun.
Minsan nga, naalala yung restaurant.
Oo, yung restaurant. Okay, we have 12 minutes left. So I think we have a lot of questions.
Sige, go. We can go overtime hanggang hindi ka naubusan ng voice.
Sige lang.
Go ahead, Eric.
Okay. So, Brother Kaloy, this question came from Brother Edwin Paul Cabing. So, question po niya is, was Father Pedro Dandan a Mason? Sorry for my ignorance. I find it odd for a priest to be a Katipunero. Thanks.
I'm not sure if there is definitive evidence that he was a Freemason. Definitely, nung panahon na yon, if you were involved in the Katipunan, you were immediately considered by the Spaniards a suspect of being involved with Freemasonry. Whether they were actually Freemasons is another matter. So as far as I have not yet come across any references to Pedro Dandan as a Freemason, I think it's important to note, like what I said before, na although there was Freemasonic influence on the Katipunan, not all Katipuneros were therefore Freemasons. So yung rank and file were not Freemasons. And there is the possibility that although some of the officers were technically members or flirted with Freemasonry, they did not accept it in such a way that it completely made them hate Catholicism. And at any rate, as I pointed out earlier, Aguinaldo himself and Deodato Arellano, the first president of the Katipunan, recanted. They retracted their membership in Freemasonry. I might not have been able to make this with sufficient force during the talk. The church condemns Freemasonry. Okay? The church condemned Freemasonry then, and it still condemns Freemasonry now. The condemnation of Freemasonry, however, is institutional, meaning we condemn the institution. And we are against Freemasonry because we oppose its principles. For us, Freemasonry is incompatible with being Catholic. It's as simple as that. Because it teaches a kind of indifferentism where all religions and all beliefs are more or less equal. And their concept of God is definitely not the God of Jesus Christ. That having been said, our attitude to individual Freemasons varies. Not all Freemasons are, kumbaga, not all of them are equally as opposed to the church. May kasi una sa lahat, even in Freemasonry, may mga iba't ibang levels, no? The higher you go in Freemasonry, the more anti-clerical, the more anti-church you become. Pero if you're simply among the rank and file sa baba, not necessarily. So even, of course, that's still not enough, no? For us, you cannot be a Catholic and a Freemason. I just want that to be clear. Ha? You cannot be a Catholic and a Freemason. But that also, kumbaga, at the same time, when we take into consideration yung condemnation ng Freemasonry, and then look at how the actual revolutionaries and Katipuneros viewed Catholicism, there is no reason for us to act as if each and every Katipunero was as anti-Catholic as, say, Andres Bonifacio. Okay. We have to be careful pa din about making such sweeping conclusions. And when there were Katipuneros who in fact were very devout, very church-going, that could be a good sign that either they were not Masons, because just because the Katipunan was influenced by the Masons does not mean that every Katipunero was a Mason. Okay, that's a fine distinction that has to be made. And second, even those Katipuneros who were Freemasons, who were nevertheless not so hostile to the church, there is, kumbaga, you can say that we can hope na they died or they lived at peace with the church later on, after this was all over. So that's a very important distinction. It's a very complicated topic. It's probably not one of those things that are easy to talk about because they involve a lot of very fine nuances. So, but there, I leave it at that muna.
Next question would be from Brother Gerald Emmanuel Senior. Is being a member of Katipunan automatically make one a Mason?
Well, it seems that was not the case. At least not outside of Manila. Kasi it seems na even yung mga very elaborate na Freemasonically inspired rituals ng Katipunan in Manila were not necessarily observed outside of Metro Manila. Like apparently in Cavite, in parts of Cavite, when the Katipuneros in Cavite would recruit, they were simply required to sign with their blood. But pero wala yung mga elaborate na rituals that you will find in Manila. And there's also a very fine distinction to make. No? All Katipuneros were revolutionaries, but not all revolutionaries were Katipuneros. Kasi there's a tendency for us to conflate the two eh. Siguro that because of our historical imagination, ini-imagine natin lahat ng mga nagtataas ng sandata at nagpupunit ng kanilang sedula, lahat sila were formal members ng Katipunan. Well, apparently not. Apparently there was still a distinction between actual members of the Katipunan and those who fought under the Katipunan. And by all accounts, many of those who simply fought under the Katipunan but not themselves Katipuneros, many of them were simple peasants, simple farmers, simple folk who probably did not see the difference between who did not see and obviously did not see any conflict between being Catholic and there between being a revolutionary. Now, whether being Catholic and being a revolutionary was compatible is not a judgment that I'm going to make in this talk. Suffice it for me to note that for many such people, there was a distinction. And it is still an important distinction because at the very least, it proves that there was, you can say, a part of the revolutionary movement that at the very least was friendly to the Catholic Church.
Okay. So this next question came from me. So is it true that fiesta were made to keep Indios uneducated?
Well, I don't really see to be honest, I don't really see the connection. But this much I can say. In order to have a fiesta, in order for people to properly understand or properly enjoy a fiesta, diba? Or a religious fiesta, that would presuppose a certain amount of knowledge. You know why you're doing it in the first place. Kasi you're doing it, sabihin natin, in honor of Saint ganito, ganyan. Or because you're doing it because you are honoring someone's, say, sabihin natin, being in heaven or canonization, or ganyan. And that at the very least is not ignorance. No? Being taught why you are practicing a certain religious, a certain religious observance will not of itself make you uneducated. Now, I can think of some siguro some families would spend so much on fiestas, no, that they'll become so poor that they'll not be able to educate their children. Pero hindi na yung kasalanan ng simbahan o ng fiesta mismo. And I would like to point out that even the church during the Spanish era, even the church tried to limit the excesses of the fiestas. Kasi sometimes they realize nga na may mga excessive rin naman yung excessive yung mga revelry minsan ng mga Filipino Christians when celebrating the fiestas. So no, I definitely do not see how it would have been designed to keep Filipinos in ignorance. At any rate, even if for the sake of argument that was the intention, it didn't work.
Okay. Next question came from Sister Joy Quadrante. So what negative experiences did Jose Rizal have to make him write his two books, The Noli Me Tangere and El Filibusterismo, which is anti-Catholic? These two books are studied by all students in high school, and how can we defend our faith?
Rizal is on record as saying to one of his friends na the reason he attacked the church was because he wanted to attack the friars. His real reason was to attack the friars. And because the friars, in his opinion, used religion as a shield, he felt forced to attack the religion. So that was his attitude. But if you're going to read both the Noli Me Tangere and the El Filibusterismo, you will note that his portrayal of Catholicism is not entirely black. In particular, in El Filibusterismo, it is a Catholic priest, Padre Florentino, who emerges as one of the good figures there. No? He's the one who listens to Simon as he dies. And it has been said that Padre Florentino is actually, you can say both Padre Florentino and Simon represent different sides of Jose Rizal. So that may show that Rizal was not entirely as anti-clerical and anti-Catholic as frequently thought. And in fact, I don't think he was that anti-Catholic. He was anti-Catholic, but not as bad as, say, Marcelo del Pilar, who really wrote a book of prayers that blasphemed Catholic prayers. So why did he have those experiences? we can speak first and foremost of the experience of the Rizal family with the Calamba, the Calamba hacienda. As you know, the Rizal family were technically tenants of the Dominican order, and they ended up becoming part of the greater struggle between the Ilustrados and the Friars when it came to land ownership. Now, to have an idea what I'm talking about here, the Friars had large haciendas, which were tenanted or farmed by various by various Filipinos. And many of these tenants were themselves quite wealthy. The Rizal family was a tenant, for example, in the Calamba hacienda. However, one of the things that the Spaniards wanted to do, or rather, one of the things that the Ilustrados wanted to do was to show that the Spanish friars did not own the land of their haciendas properly. Kumbaga, hindi sound yung title nila to these lands, to the friar lands. And their goal was first to be able to dispossess the friars of these lands for a variety of reasons. They felt that it was unfair to Filipinos. They felt na it was not good for the religious orders themselves kasi para sa kanila, this made the religious orders corrupt. Yun yung pananaw ng mga revolution, ng mga Ilustrados at least. And more importantly, Rizal apparently wanted to fight the Dominicans over the Calamba hacienda because he wanted to see how far he can go in his legal battle with the friars. He wanted to make a point, basically. He wanted to push it as far as he could to see just how equal Filipinos really were under the law when it came to in comparison with the friars. Now, yun yung side ng mga Ilustrados, ha? The friars have their own side. As far as they were concerned naman, the haciendas were there to support various colleges, various good works, and the missionary works that they had in Asia. And of course, for the Spanish Dominicans, being Spaniards, for them, their land ownership was legal. It was not an act of dispossession against the natives. Yung dati palagi natin isipin, na usually may magkakaiba yung sides, magkakaiba yung pananaw nila. Kasi we sometimes have a tendency to assume na the Spaniards did what they did simply because they were greedy or evil or whatever. No? They had their reasons for doing what they did. You can agree or disagree, but they had their reasons for what they did. So, coming back to Rizal himself, there really isn't any proof na Rizal became anti-clerical or anti-friar because he had bad experiences. There is not actually any proof that had happened. He definitely had negative experiences of Spanish snobbery back when he was a student in Intramuros, but there is no proof that he suffered discrimination at the hands of Spanish priests and religious. There's no proof. In fact, Father Villaroel, in his book on Rizal and UST, has showed that Jose Rizal, as a student in UST, was actually favored a lot. No? He was treated very well by the Dominican friars. Looks like what happened to Rizal is what happens to many young intellectuals when put in a environment that is non-Catholic. They got impressed by the intellectual brilliance of their peers who were non-Catholic or anti-Catholic, and they simply lost their faith, at least part of their faith. No? Looks like that is what happened to Rizal. He went to Spain. He was impressed by the dominant free thinking there. He was influenced by men like Miguel Moraita. He was influenced by his reading of Voltaire. And so because of that, he lost his faith in the supernatural, in the Catholic Church. But what is frequently forgotten there is that Noli and Fili were written when he was quite young. He was only around 30 years old when he finished the El Filibusterismo. When he went to the Philippines, he was exiled to Dapitan in 1892. He actually attended Mass at the church, although he did not receive communion. But he was known to regularly attend Mass at the church in Dapitan. Not necessarily every Sunday, but many Sundays. No? Every couple of Sundays or so, he would be seen at church in Dapitan. So that tells you that his anti-Catholicism was not as deep-seated. And of course, we believe that he retracted. So how do you defend the faith when you are reading Noli and Fili? I think it's important to know two things. First and foremost, Noli and Fili are works of fiction. Okay? They are works of fiction. Padre Damaso is not a real person. Maria Clara is not a real person. She was based on the figure of a poor Clare nun who went mad in the Santa Clara Monastery of Manila, but there is no evidence that this mad nun was ever sexually abused. It looked like she simply went mad. She was seen raving one day on the roof of the Santa Clara Monastery in Intramuros. And that was one of the inspirations for the Maria Clara figure. Pero yung buong storya na ginawa ni Rizal about the daughter of a friar na inabuso ng isang masama pang praile, that's fiction. So, why should you judge the doctrines of the Catholic Church on the basis of a work of fiction? I think that's the easiest answer.
Okay. So we're down with last three questions. So this question came from Brother Romeo C. Tuazon Jr. So good afternoon po. Yung Gombursa po ba ay namatay na Katoliko pa rin? Totoo po ba yung well, nasagot na po itong question ito. Well, yung namatay po ba yung mga yung Gombursa na Katoliko pa din?
Yeah. So they died as Catholics. They died with their cassocks on. Okay. And when Rafael Izquierdo, the Governor General, asked the Archbishop of Manila, Gregorio Meliton Martinez, to defrock them, to remove their priesthood, the Archbishop of Manila refused. So that's why they died wearing their cassocks, to symbolize that they were dying as Catholic priests. We know that one of the priests, Father Jacinto Zamora, lost his mind. He went insane before he was about to be executed. But going insane is not the same as losing your faith. He simply died insane. And that's sad, no? Kasi apparently he was a young, bright, promising priest, and hindi niya matanggap na he was going to be executed for a crime he did not commit. As for Burgos, we know na when Burgos was about to be executed, medyo siya, no? Medyo he made a bit of a scene, although hindi naman yung hysterical na parang pinortray doon sa movie na Rizal, pero he made a bit of a scene, and he calmed down kasi he said, "I die innocent." And someone cried out to him, "So did Christ." And that was enough to calm him down. So that tells you that he had that faith, no? He was able to summon that final fortitude to be able to die like Christ. As for Padre Gomez, the oldest of the priests, it was noted that he was extremely calm when he faced execution. And he said, I forget the exact words, but he said something along the lines of, "Let us go where even the leaves do not stir without God's will." So he definitely died with a lot of faith. Minsan nga pag binabasa ko yung execution, sometimes I could not help but think it. Perhaps I wouldn't be surprised if Padre Gomez was a saintly man, even, given the way he so calmly faced his own death after serving as a priest since 1824 in Bacoor. So he died 1872. He had been a parish priest for 48 years.
So having that kind of documents for the Gomburza, why is it that they are not being considered for canonization?
That's a good question. I think they're not being considered for canonization because their execution was political rather than they were executed ostensibly because they had been rebels against Spain. So that's the reason. That having been said, I myself have thought about that. Kasi because of two factors. First and foremost, they were hurriedly sentenced to death under the influence of Rafael Izquierdo, the Governor General. Governor General Rafael Izquierdo was a Freemason. So one can argue that he had these three priests executed, but he had a number of Freemasons who were implicated in the Cavite Mutiny released from prison. But the three priests, pinapatay niya. So I think you can make a case na the Spanish Governor General actually had them killed because they were priests. Kumbaga, nakahanap siya ng opportunity to kill some priests, he took it. So I myself, I'm curious about the possibility that perhaps they died in odium fidei. They died because of hatred of the faith. Pero ano ko lang yun, speculation ko lang yun for now. It's just my informed speculation. For now, since the official reason they were killed was for rebellion, well, that's not grounds for canonization. I guess someone could take up the study to see whether they could be considered as martyrs.
So I have another question here from Ray Ann Mendoza. So any recommendations for a good history book that is not biased against the church? Thanks po.
What a tough question. Nahihirapan ako sagutin yan. Pero, okay. My own counsel would be to start with the least biased book. And that, whether we like it or not, the historical works of Gregorio Zaide, such as his Pageant of Philippine History, at yung kanyang much shorter na book on Philippine history, are still good starting points. Take note what I said, starting points. Kaya starting points kasi maraming mga bagay sa mga libro niya, they outdated na or na-correct na. So it's just a starting point. You need to have a basic structure of your understanding of Philippine history. And then from there, you can look for the works of the Jesuit historians, Father John Schumacher, and Father Rene, and Father Jose Arcilia, and Father Rene Haveliana. So Ateneo has had a good school of Jesuit historians who have produced many works that are good places to have a Catholic viewpoint on Philippine history. If you're lucky enough, you can find in really old used books or antique shops a rare copy of the History of the Catholic Church in the Philippines by Father Pablo Fernandez, a Dominican. Kaya lang, this is very rare. Another good history book is the History of the Philippines by Antonio Molina, but that's also very rare. It was published in 1960. He has a Spanish language history of the Philippines. I don't think it's been translated into English. So right now, I think that the best thing is not so much to look for a one volume. It's kumbaga, you start with what you can know about Philippine history from the standard books, and then you read them with some grains of salt, some caution, and then you move forward reading the books of Catholic historians on the Philippines.
Okay,
I
so
advise.
okay. So last two questions na lang po, may mga humabol na questions eh. So this question came from Mark Reyes, galing po sa FB. So bilang historiador, ano ang relasyon ng pantayong pananaw ni na Zeus Salazar sa kasaysayan ng Katolisismo? Reynaldo Ileto, Pasyon at Revolusyon, Verum Est, at yung second, what about Patronato Real?
Okay, I'll start with the Patronato Real. The Patronato Real is an extremely difficult topic kasi it's about the close relationship between the Spanish Church and the Spanish state. And in fact, the Patronato Real in Spain itself lasted until 1976. Okay. So in a nutshell, when you speak of the Patronato Real, you are talking about the obligation of the state on one hand to support the church. Kaya nga patronato, patronage. No? The obligation of the state to exercise its protection and its support over the church. In turn, the church surrendered significant parts of its independence to the state. So for example, appointments to church positions usually had to go through the state. Kaya, although, for example, bishops, although it was the Pope who made the final appointment, candidacies for the episcopate had to go through the Spanish government. It was the king who formally presented the bishops, and Rome simply gave the approval. And much of the time, it was a pro forma or token approval. Although there were also occasions when Rome refused to accept the appointments. In the Philippines and many other places, appointments all the way down to parish priest level had to go through the government. So that's the patronato. So that's an example of the patronato real. In exchange, it was the government that was obliged to support the activities of the church financially, economically. Missionary work was also supported by the state. So kaya nga dapat bawat missionary in the Philippines is supposed to be supplied with a certain amount of flour, a certain amount of wine, a certain amount of food, to ensure their survival. Now, as to why this happened, why is it that the church required a lot of authority? Why is it that the state required a lot of authority over the church? There were many reasons. One of these is you have to look into the history of Spain to understand where this is coming from, and for that matter, the history of Europe. Historically, Europe was ruled by kings and by emperors, Christian kings and Christian emperors, who considered the purity of the faith to be part of their mandate. Walang separation of church and state noon. The king did not just stick to temporal matters. Defending the purity of the faith was part and parcel of the job of a king. So in order to be able to ensure the purity of the doctrine of the church, many kings in Europe asked for and received varying amounts of control over the church. Now you may ask, so what's the difference between that and England, where Henry VIII had the Church of England? There's a big difference. In the Church of England, the king became the final arbiter of everything, even doctrine. So King Henry VIII and his successors, sila yung final na arbiter ng doctrine. But in Catholic kingdoms like Spain, Portugal, which had an even more expansive patronado, Spain, France, Portugal, the two Sicilies, ganyan, yung mga countries that had patronato, the kings had enormous amounts of power over the over the church, but they did not have final and absolute power. The Pope still retained veto functions. May veto power pa rin yung Pope over what the king can do. So in that sense, the Catholic communion was, kumbaga, communion ng mga national churches with Rome was left unimpaired. That having been said, as the centuries went by, the church began to have a more and more negative view of the patronato, which is why in 1976, when Francisco Franco had died, the church was only too happy to get rid of the patronato real in Spain itself. Now, yung earlier question about the pantayong pananaw, I'll admit, I'm not an expert on the nuances of the pantayong pananaw. Although when I was in UP, we were of course educated in it, but I'm not sure I've mastered all of the nuances of the school of thought involved in it. All I can say is when you are dealing with the concept of tayo, the very moment you define what is tayo, you also implicitly define who is sila na hindi tayo. And ang philosophical question ko palagi dyan is, who defines tayo? Who defines us? Who is us? Who are us? Who are we Filipinos? Ano yung Filipino viewpoint? Ano yung pantayong viewpoint? Who defines it? If it simply becomes an exercise in yung tinatawag na indigenism, yung indigenista thinking na tayo refers to anything not foreign, then I have a problem with that. If it refers to the idea na we Filipinos deserve to be able to look at events from our own perspective, then I'm in favor of that. I don't know if that answers the question. I guess it doesn't, no? But siguro before I end the Q&A, I just leave this thought. We are Filipinos, but we are not only Filipinos. We are always part of a greater community. No Filipino thinks of himself only as a Filipino. It's either you think of yourself as a Filipino and as part of the human family, right? Or as a Filipino as an Asian, Filipino and Southeast Asian. So all of us think of ourselves not just as part of a national family, but also of a transnational family. For Catholics, we think of ourselves not just as Filipinos, but also as Catholics who are Filipinos. And inevitably, this can raise some tensions. Why? Because, for example, as a Catholic, as a Filipino Catholic, as a Filipino, I would see the people of my country, the Philippines, as my group, my tribe. But as a Catholic, I also see all Catholics as part of my group, as part of my tribe. And so when I read about the Friars, on one hand, as a Filipino, they are foreign to me because they're Spaniard. But as a Catholic, they are not foreign to me. They are part of my family because they are Catholic. And so we Filipino Catholics, we need to be able to live with that tension between being Filipino and being Catholic. And it is in the Catholic Church precisely because the Catholic Church transcends all national boundaries. I think the Catholic Church helps us to attain a greater perspective, a higher perspective. Personally, for me, one of the reasons I can read about Philippine history and I can be very, you can say, dispassionate or detached when I read about the friars and the reasons they did what they did, is because for me, as a Catholic, I owe it to them as fellow Catholics to listen to their voices and not consider them to be enemies or strangers. And I love the fact that I'm Catholic. And so I love the fact that as a Catholic, we still have that communion, that fellowship, even with people from abroad. In a higher plane, we are actually still one with them through the church. Okay.
Kaya pa po ba ng mag-entertain pa ng questions? May mga humabol pa. Okay, so first, okay. So, ito po nanggaling sa Facebook page ng Know the Truth, coming from Brother Alvin Valesa. Gusto lang po niyang linawin. So, Aglipayan and Rizalian are considered denomination or sect, right?
Aglipayan and Rizalian, yes, they would be Aglipayan would be denominations, would be a denomination. Rizalian would be a sect. Usually, we use the term sect for groups that are not really Christian. Rizalians or the Rizalistas, they tend to worship Rizal as God or as an incarnation of Jesus Christ. So we do not consider that to be Christian. The Aglipayans, at least, we consider them to be still Christians. Even if we have questions about the validity of their baptism, in a somewhat looser sense, because they believe in Jesus Christ, they somehow believe in Jesus Christ, we consider them to be Christian. Now, what complicates factors is what complicates matters is the fact that maraming iba't ibang klase ng Rizalista at marami ring iba't ibang klase ng Aglipayan. Like yung Aglipay, as long as Aglipay was alive, they were one church. But when he died, shortly after he died, nahati sa dalawa. Meron yung Unitarian at meron yung Trinitarian, the grupo. And each of them have gone their own ways. Yung Aglipayan Church as we know it now is the Trinitarian group. Pero even they, alam ko, may mga iba't iba silang internal schisms. Yung Rizalista naman, iba't iba rin yan. Meron pa nga Rizalista na, na Marcos loyalist din . So, at meron naman mga Rizalista that have coalesced or have fused with much older sects that stayed in that are located, for example, in Mount Banahaw. Pero as a general rule, pag sinabi mong Aglipayan, denomination yan. Pag sinabi mong Rizalista, sekta yan.
So, question coming from Lanchester Edralin. So, question po, I have read in the book Church in the Far East that Humabon, a powerful chief in Cebu, baptized. He was named given Carlos I, being a native and then Catholic. Does the Chief Carlos Humabon can be recognized as a native Catholic monarch, considering that Magellan did not conquer Humabon Cebu and instead did a treaty in the form of Santuguan?
Well, I guess I would say that he was a Catholic monarch. But the problem is, after the survivors of the Magellan expedition left Cebu, we don't really have solid, trustworthy information anymore about what happened to him and his fellow baptizandi. Yung mga bago. Remember when the survivors of Magellan's expedition left Cebu, they were not very Humabon had been baptized not for long. So I don't know how after that they seem to have reverted to paganism. So to the extent that they reverted to paganism, then he was not a Catholic monarch anymore. But as long as he was at least externally a Catholic monarch, yes, he was a Catholic monarch. Actually, yan yung ano eh, yan yung mga difficulties minsan about our history. Because ang dami-daming butas. Ang dami-daming mga missing pieces of the puzzle that still have to be more firmly put on firm ground. And it doesn't help that many Filipino enthusiasts of history and many Filipino historians tend to make a lot of wide sweeping claims on the basis of scrappy information because of the hunger nga to have a much fuller history than we actually have.
Okay, so last question na po talaga. So ito, personal question coming from me. So minana natin yung pananampalataya natin mula sa mga Espanyol. At we can see ngayon sa Espanya that their faith medyo nawawala, especially when they mock their priest. The priest dun sa Spain nowadays is kumbaga they're not wearing clerics para hindi sila ma-identify na priest kasi namamak sila in public. So what could have gone wrong in Spain na pwede natin consider para maiwasan natin din sa Philippines?
I think one issue kasi with the Spaniards, with Spanish culture that I see, is they have a very real tendency to swing to extremes. When the Spanish are Catholic, they're really, 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 really Catholic. They're really, 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 really devout. When they are anti-Catholic, they're really, 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 really anti-Catholic. A symbol of this was the fact that about a decade ago, I think, or even 2 decades ago, there was a cooking show in Spain, and one of the things they did was they cooked a crucifix. Talagang public blasphemy. And of course, it's in Spain that you have this horrendous art exhibit involving consecrated hosts na kinuha nung artist for over a period of so many of a year yata or so. Tapos ginawa niyang art installation yung consecrated na hosts, and the Spanish government wouldn't do anything about it. So I would say, I remember, okay. When I was in Spain, I was talking to this classicist from Galicia, and he told me that he noticed that there was something different about Spaniards who had Filipino blood. He said that the Spaniards who had Filipino blood tended to be gentler and softer than Spaniards who were Spaniards. Yung talagang European ng origin. And while I'm not really the type to ascribe personality differences to blood, or to ancestry, although it may have some influence, I think one of the saving graces of us Filipinos historically is that historically we have never really been a people of immense fanaticism. We have never really been a people fanatical for any religion as a whole. Individuals, yes, there are always individual fanatics, but not really as a people. So, however, I am beginning to see the beginnings of political fanaticism in our country. I think lahat naman ng listeners ko know what I'm talking about. Yung fanaticism yung fanatical devotion to a certain political figure. And to the point na lahat i-justify in defense of that person. So that scares me because historically we Filipinos are not like that. We should avoid that tendency to go into extremes. That's all I can say. And as for us, the gift of faith that we have received from Spain, we should not take it for granted. Because, I was like I said, when I was in Spain, I was going around the churches, looking at all the beautiful churches, visiting the tombs of saints, But I couldn't help but think, here they are surrounded by all this beautiful sacred art, all these beautiful reminders of their faith, all these relics of saints, and yet the vast majority of Spaniards are not interested in it. Nakakalungkot. They got desensitized to their own faith, I think. Let's not allow that to happen to us.
Okay, thank you, Brother Kaloy. So, Sir Henry.
Just want to,
Okay, I think
I just want to add again, this is just intended to be the beginning. In 2021, I plan to give various talks on various elements of Philippine church history. So, pang-umpisa pa lang to. This is supposed to be really just an intro, no? Just a informal intro. But in the coming months, I hope to be able to discuss matters more thoroughly and more in detail. Okay, back to you, Sir Henry.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Brother Kaloy. I think this topic is quite interesting. Not limited to the Philippines, although you have touched a lot of subjects. There is more to it. Yes, sa 2021, make sure you come prepared with all the 500 years of history of Christianity in the Philippines.
It has to be over several days.
And then also the progress of, just like within the power. I know, yeah. Just like when you study the Catholic faith, talagang malalim. Ito nga, 500 years na eh. Imagine when you keep church history, that's the 200 years of history. Anyway, the interest is like the progress of the Catholicism or Christianity all over the world. Let's say, for example, we have to wrap up now, just a few more minutes on the comments, that in USA, tinutumba nila yung mga estatwa, no? It would be also good to see what transpire. Pag-aralan natin, o pag-aralan din ng simbahan, bakit ikakagan yung mga tao, ano ba yung kakulangan, ano ba yung dapat na ginagawa. So in the Philippines, ganun din, no? The Catholic faith is quite insulted by the people even in politics. The same thing with Europe, no? The lukewarmness of the Europeans, just like you when you went to Spain, no? Di ba? Bago pandemic. In a way, hindi ka nakaalis doon, maging expert ka na ngayon sa ano. Imagine, when was that? March, no? Andun ka?
I got out of Madrid.
11, 9. There'll be 9.
Out of Madrid the day before they had their lockdown.
The day before.
Before they locked down.
Yeah.
Back into Manila the day before we got locked. I would have been trapped there for months.
Yeah, precisely. Yeah. Kaya with God's grace, no? Kaya that would not. Yeah, it's quite interesting. So I think, Kaloy, you have some assignment for defensores. Is that it's not doctrinal. It's about the approach of Christianity. When Jesus said, "When I come back, will I still see faith? No, will I still see that faith?" It's becoming truer and truer in many parts of the world. So maybe the bastion of Catholicism, hindi naman sa inano natin dahil nasa Pilipinas tayo. Pero medyo andun pa yung conservativeness, andun pa yung pagiging Kristiyano. Even divorce and contraceptions are a no-no in the Philippines, whereas in other countries, they are already permitted. Okay, what as Filipinos we should do to evangelize? That's why isa lang tayo sa apologetics group. But sa ating mga estudyante and sa mga manonood pa in the future, let's keep it in mind that what we can do to increase our faith, touch the faith of our neighbors and friends. Okay, with that, an announcement in next week talk, in the fold of her mantle, in Untitled ni Brother Caloy sa next talk. This will be the testimonies of converts and reverts, no, how they embrace the Catholic faith. I myself, I'm a revert. I was a lukewarm Catholic and still studying the faith. So with that, we can close the session. Unless, Kaloy, you have one last word
Yung nabanggit mo
for
kanina
our
nga,
students.
yung nabanggit nga natin kanina, no, about evangelization. Yung evangelization is something that's always urgent. And we cannot be complacent then kasi tayo mga Pilipino, we're very, very open to foreign influences. So, sa nakikita natin, as the West becomes more and more liberal and more aggressive in pushing forward with a very secular and sometimes anti-Christian mentality, we have to be prepared for that same mentality to arrive here in the Philippines. And we cannot afford to be ill-prepared. I think the best thing that we can do right now among ourselves, no, is to really intensify our study. Hindi pwedeng yung happy na tayo sa nalalaman natin. We should always be hungry. And most of all, when we study, let's study with the view to being able to share the faith. It's not because we want to be the stars of our own little shows. It's not because we want to be called apologists. It's simply because that's what we baptized Catholics do, which is share the faith, share Christ. We don't have to know everything. No one can do that anyway. We don't have to be master of many fields of theology or philosophy or history or apologetics. But at least I would urge everyone's listening now, master one field as much as you can within the bounds of possibility. To the extent na you can, as a family person, as a laborer, as a job holder, kung ano yung magagawa mo to master one thing, one field where you can share the faith, please do so. Kasi we really need people to be more passionate about our faith.
Nawawala yung audio mo, Kaloy. Okay, so with that, we will see you next week. We'll just say a short prayer. Name, Father, Son, Holy Spirit. Amen. We give you thanks, Almighty God, for the benefit of learning from Brother Caloy in his talk about the history, the 500 years history of the Philippines. May this talk prompt us to be more zealous in our faith and take it seriously. May you allow us to learn more about apostolate, to bring our relatives and friends to the Catholic faith or deepening their faith. As our motto, to make good Catholic become better Catholic. We ask the Holy Spirit to bless our apostolate and our students. We ask this in the mighty name of Jesus Christ. Together with the Holy Spirit, one God forever and ever. Amen. And may the Lord grant us his peace and life everlasting. Amen. Name, Father, Holy Spirit. Okay, friends, see you next week. Please, you can still watch this show, replace Cedar Media and Defensores Fidei discussion group. If you're not a member yet of the Defensores Fidei discussion group, please join. Sige, sa mga participant, please include us in your prayers. See you again next week. We'll meet our converts and reverts. Goodbye.